Hey guys, tonight we're setting our sights on a figure who once controlled the most dangerous corridors along the US-Mexico border. Picture the heat clinging to your skin like a wet blanket, the dust of Matamoros swirling lazily as streetlights buzz over empty sidewalks. This was the world young Osiel Cárdenas Guillén knew all too well. A place where opportunity felt distant and survival often required sharp elbows and sharper instincts. You probably won't survive this story if you imagine yourself walking his streets. The danger was real, even for locals who knew the rhythms of every alleyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments, because I'm curious who's tuning in and from where. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Osiel's story begins humbly, though the term humble might feel too polished for the conditions of 1970s Matamoros. The city sits just across from Brownsville, Texas, its streets humming with commerce by day and hushed whispers by night. For families like the Cárdenas Guillén household, opportunities were scarce. Osiel was born into modest means, the kind of home where every peso stretched thin and older siblings doubled as surrogate parents when mothers worked late. He learned early how to navigate the unspoken rules of the neighborhood, a skill that would shape the rest of his life. As a boy, Osiel wasn't especially imposing, but he was observant, one of those kids who knew when to keep his head down and when to flash a quick grin to diffuse tension. Friends from that era remember a wiry teenager who seemed to move faster than everyone else, both in thought and in action. He could dart between street vendors without knocking over a single fruit stand, a skill that might sound trivial but earned him favor among older boys who used him as a runner. Matamoros wasn't the most forgiving place for young dreamers. Factories on the US border drew workers in with the promise of steady wages, but layoffs came just as quickly. Many residents supplemented incomes with side hustles, selling contraband electronics, cigarettes, or liquor smuggled across the Rio Grande. Osiel watched it all quietly, clocking who succeeded and who disappeared overnight. He saw uncles and neighbors lean on informal economies because the formal ones left no room for them. By the time he hit his teens, Osiel's understanding of the border economy was sharper than most adults. He knew which bars catered to truckers willing to move packages in exchange for extra cash, and which law enforcement officers could be persuaded to look the other way. It wasn't hero's work, and it certainly wasn't safe, but to young Osiel, it was practical. You survive, or you fade, a cousin once told him. The late 1970s and early 80s brought another layer of pressure. Drug trafficking routes shifted as Colombian cocaine began flooding through Mexico, replacing the marijuana and heroin corridors of the previous decade. Smuggling operations expanded quickly, and Matamoros became a hub where money and risk intertwined. Kids Osiel's age might play soccer one day and vanish the next, rumored to be running loads of powder through the brush. He watched these disappearances quietly, noting which families received condolence money and which were left with only rumors. Even as a young teenager, Osiel displayed flashes of charm. Teachers said he was bright but restless, often distracted by opportunities outside the classroom. He wasn't the best student, but he understood people, their motivations, fears, and weak spots. He could read a room before stepping into it, a trait that later allowed him to navigate cartel politics like a seasoned negotiator. But back then, it meant he avoided unnecessary trouble, which was no small feat in a city where one wrong glance could invite retaliation. Osiel's family worried about him, especially his mother, who tried to steer him toward legitimate work. She hoped he might find steady employment at a maquiladora or apprentice with a mechanic. But those options paid little and offered even less respect. He wanted more than survival. He wanted status, the kind that turned heads when you walked down the street. Many people still think that poverty alone drives criminal ambition, but in Osiel's case, it was also about recognition. There's an open debate among those who knew him. Was he a product of his environment, or was something in his nature always drawn to risk? Some argue he had no choice. Born into a system stacked against him, he simply followed the path available. Others remember moments when he could have stepped away, but didn't. So what do you think? Would Osiel have lived a quieter life had opportunity knocked earlier? Or was his trajectory always set? By the early 80s, Osiel's restlessness had become hard to ignore. He began running small errands for local smugglers, usually simple tasks like delivering envelopes or picking up supplies. But each job offered a glimpse of a world where money moved freely, where men in flashy cars commanded instant respect. And each time he got paid, Osiel tucked away pesos with the discipline of someone who understood how quickly fortune could turn. There's a story locals like to tell, though its accuracy is murky. One night, a border patrol checkpoint popped up on a route Osiel was traveling with a small package. Instead of panicking, he reportedly turned his bike around, cut through an overgrown trail, and re-emerged miles down the road, package intact. Whether it actually happened or not, the story cemented his reputation as clever under pressure. People noticed, by his late teens, Osiel had contacts who could open doors into larger operations. He was still at the bottom rung, but he could feel the ladder stretching upward. That sense of momentum was intoxicating. And yet, as he hustled through those early years, he couldn't have imagined how high and how dangerously he'd eventually climb. He also couldn't have predicted that his name would one day strike fear across Mexico, or that his rise would be tied to an elite group of soldiers who would become his enforcers and, eventually, his undoing. For now, though, Osiel was simply a young man navigating the streets of Matamoros, trying to carve out a future in a world that rarely gave second chances. Osiel's teenage years moved at a pace that seemed to mirror the feverish energy of the border itself. Each day brought new faces, whispered deals, and the steady hum of opportunity disguised as risk. It wasn't long before his small errands for local smugglers evolved into bigger jobs, ones that required him to understand the machinery of illicit trade, rather than just being a cog in it. In the early 1980s, Matamoros was a pressure cooker of ambition and fear. The Gulf Cartel, though not yet the fearsome juggernaut it would become, already dominated the smuggling routes in Tamaulipas. Cocaine shipments from Colombia, increasingly squeezed by U.S. interdiction efforts in the Caribbean, had begun flowing through Mexico's porous borders. These were the currents that carried young men upward or dragged them under. Osiel, sharp-eyed and restless, knew he couldn't remain a low-level courier forever. He started shadowing older operators, learning which routes avoided checkpoints and how to blend in with the endless stream of cars crossing the border. He listened when seasoned smugglers talked about how to package drugs to avoid canine detection, and how to quietly pay off corrupt officials without attracting attention. He rarely asked questions aloud, but his ability to remember details made him invaluable. People noticed that he never forgot a name, a route, or a promised payment. Osiel's rise, however, wasn't just about cleverness. he also developed a reputation for reliability. If he promised to deliver a package, it arrived. If he committed to a schedule, he kept it, even if that meant sleeping in fields or back seats of cars for days at a time. That level of discipline was rare in a world full of impulsive risk-takers, and it made him stand out to cartel lieutenants searching for future leaders. Still, the work carried obvious dangers. Border patrols were increasing in number, and rival smugglers weren't above ambushing each other's crews. One night, while ferrying a modest shipment of marijuana across the river, Osiel and a friend were nearly caught in the beam of a patrol boat's spotlight. They dove into the frigid water and clung to tree roots for nearly an hour, their lungs burning with effort as agents swept the shoreline. When the light finally passed, they pulled themselves out, drenched and shivering but alive. That experience left a mark. It was the first time Osiel understood how easily a single mistake could erase him. By his early 20s, Osiel had managed to climb higher than many of his peers. He was trusted with larger shipments, ones that involved coordination between multiple safe houses and drivers. That trust came with better pay and access to the inner circle of Gulf cartel operators. He began attending informal meetings at ranch houses just outside town, where older men discussed strategy over grilled meat and bottles of beer. Those gatherings revealed the cartel's internal rivalries. Ambitious lieutenants jockeyed for position, whispering alliances one day and sabotaging each other the next. Osiel learned quickly to keep his opinions to himself and to listen more than he spoke. He cultivated a persona of quiet competence, never seeming too eager, never aligning too closely with any one faction. It was a delicate balance, and many underestimated him because of it. A mistake that would later cost them dearly. At this stage, Osiel was still a subordinate, but the seeds of leadership were taking root. He began forming his own network of trusted associates, young men like himself who were hungry but disciplined. He made a point of treating them fairly, paying them on time and shielding them from unnecessary risks. That loyalty was reciprocated, creating a small but tight-knit crew that answered to him rather than to older bosses. There's a famous story from this period, though, as always in cartel lore, its details shift depending on who tells it. One evening, an older smuggler tried to short Osiel's crew on their share of a payout. Most young operators would have swallowed the loss to avoid conflict, but Osiel calmly confronted the man in front of everyone. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the numbers and explained that trust was a two-way street. The smuggler, perhaps impressed by the younger man's composure, handed over the missing cash without further argument. That quiet display of backbone earned Osiel more respect than any outburst could have. During these years, the Mexican government was increasingly pressured by the United States to crack down on drug trafficking. But corruption ran deep, and many officials were on cartel payrolls. Osiel observed how the right payment at the right time could make entire problems disappear. He also saw how dangerous it was to rely too heavily on corrupt officials. Loyalty bought with bribes could vanish overnight. That understanding would shape his later decisions, for better and worse. Many people still think that Osiel's ascent was inevitable. But those who lived alongside him recall that there were moments when he could have stepped away. He was earning enough to live comfortably, and his family urged him to find safer work. But ambition had taken root, and ambition rarely lets go quietly. He could see a future where he wasn't just running shipments for others, but calling the shots himself. As the 1990s approached, Osiel's name began circulating among higher-ranking Gulf cartel leaders. He was seen as capable, resourceful, and, perhaps most importantly, not openly threatening. That last perception would prove crucial. Cartel bosses rarely tolerated rivals who appeared too eager for power, but Osiel's measured demeanor allowed him to move up the hierarchy without triggering suspicion. There's an open scholarly debate about whether this phase of his life was driven more by circumstance or by calculated design. Some argue that he simply adapted to opportunities as they arose, while others believe he was strategically positioning himself from the start. So what do you think? Was Osiel just riding the wave of events, or was he quietly steering his own destiny even then? One thing is certain. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Osiel had built a reputation that reached beyond Matamoros. He was no longer the boy darting between street vendors to avoid trouble. He was a rising figure in a criminal enterprise that would soon dominate headlines on both sides of the border. And though he couldn't know it yet, the decisions he made in the coming years would lead to alliances with men whose loyalty could not be bought, and whose eventual betrayal would shake the Gulf cartel to its core. By the early 1990s, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's name was whispered not just in Matamoros, but across Tamaulipas. His ability to stay composed under pressure and deliver results reliably made him an asset to the Gulf cartel, and he knew it. This was the period when small-time hustlers either burned out or solidified their places in the organization's complex hierarchy. Osiel wasn't about to fade into obscurity. He had started to forge real connections with senior cartel lieutenants, the kind of men who wore tailored shirts and spoke in measured tones, but whose authority could extinguish lives without raising their voices. Through discreet dinners and after-hours strategy sessions, Osiel gained access to the deeper workings of the cartel's empire. He absorbed the details, how shipments moved from Colombia by sea, how drugs were stashed in hidden compartments of tractor trailers, and how money was laundered through seemingly legitimate businesses. At first, Osiel was a quiet observer, taking mental notes on who trusted whom, which routes were most lucrative, and which lieutenants harbored grudges against one another. He knew the value of information and how a casual comment could shift alliances. One mentor-like figure, an older smuggler named El Negro, told him, "The money's easy. The politics will kill you if you don't learn them." That advice stuck. As Osiel's profile grew, so did the responsibilities entrusted to him. He was soon supervising entire shipments rather than just transporting them. This meant coordinating drivers, securing stash houses, and ensuring that law enforcement, or rival cartels, never intercepted the product. Any mistake could cost millions. Yet Osiel thrived under that pressure, and his reputation as someone who got the job done began to crystallize. There's an infamous story from this era. One of Osiel's shipments, a truck loaded with cocaine, was stopped by a corrupt police unit, hoping to skim off the cargo. Rather than panic or resort to violence, Osiel reportedly walked into the police station with a wad of cash and a smile, negotiating the release of the truck without a single bullet fired. True or exaggerated, the tale reinforced an image of Osiel as a man who could handle crises with calm calculation. His growing clout inevitably attracted rivals. Ambitious lieutenants who had spent years clawing their way up the ranks didn't appreciate a younger operator rising so quickly. Subtle acts of sabotage began. A promised delivery vehicle would disappear, or a trusted contact would suddenly become unreliable. But Osiel managed to sidestep these traps, using his network of loyal crew members to gather intelligence and keep one step ahead. The Gulf Cartel during this time was led by Juan Garcia Abrego, a formidable figure who had built the organization into a multinational drug empire. Osiel admired Abrego's vision, though he rarely interacted with him directly. Still, he studied Abrego's methods, noting how the boss used a mix of fear, generosity, and political connections to maintain control. That blend of leadership traits would later shape Osiel's own style. Meanwhile, the United States had declared a full-fledged war on drugs, and Mexican traffickers were under increasing scrutiny. Osiel understood that the stakes were rising. Larger profits meant harsher crackdowns, and he watched as law enforcement in both countries invested heavily in border security. But he also observed how corruption seeped into these very agencies, making them exploitable. A well-timed bribe could neutralize the threat of a raid, or buy critical information about pending investigations. Many people still think that Osiel's rapid ascent was purely luck, but those who worked alongside him noticed his deliberate approach. He didn't flaunt wealth prematurely, a mistake that had toppled many young smugglers. Instead, he reinvested his earnings into the business and built goodwill among his crew by paying them fairly. He was shrewd enough to understand that loyalty couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. There's an open scholarly debate about how much Osiel's personality played into his rise. Was he genuinely charismatic, or did his calm demeanor simply make others project confidence onto him? Some argue that he mastered the art of letting others underestimate him, only revealing his strength when absolutely necessary. So what do you think? Was Osiel truly magnetic, or just exceptionally strategic? As he climbed higher, Osiel began to take on more visible roles at cartel gatherings. He was no longer the silent observer in the corner. His voice carried weight in discussions about routes, profits, and discipline. He also forged closer relationships with military-trained bodyguards and former police officers, men who provided both protection and muscle. This circle of enforcers would later form the foundation of something far more dangerous. By the mid-1990s, Osiel's position was secure enough that he could begin grooming protégés of his own. He sought out young operators who, like him, combined ambition with a willingness to learn. Many of these recruits came from the same neighborhoods he'd once roamed, and he made a point of showing them that loyalty to him brought real rewards. But as Osiel's influence expanded, so did the risk of exposure. He was aware that law enforcement agencies, both in Mexico and the US, were tracking his every move. One night, after narrowly evading what he believed was an undercover surveillance team, he told a friend, "They see me now. I'm not invisible anymore." That acknowledgement would shape the way he operated going forward. This was also the period when Osiel began building the personal brand of a leader. He dressed better, drove nicer cars, and attended more high-profile social events. Yet, he kept one foot grounded in the neighborhoods where he'd grown up, knowing that community ties offered a kind of protection money couldn't buy. Locals might not love him, but many respected him, or at least feared the consequences of betraying him. By the late 1990s, with Juan Garcia Abrego facing increasing legal trouble and internal tensions boiling over, Osiel's steady climb put him in a prime position. He wasn't the heir apparent, at least not yet, but he was undeniably a contender. And though he wouldn't admit it openly, he was beginning to imagine what it would mean to hold the reins of the Gulf Cartel himself. He also understood, perhaps better than most, that ambition came with a cost. Rivals were sharpening knives in the shadows, waiting for any misstep. The question wasn't whether someone would challenge him, but when. By the late 1990s, the Gulf Cartel was in a state of simmering volatility, and Osiel Cárdenas Guillén, now firmly entrenched as a rising power, knew it. The organization had grown wealthy and sprawling under Juan Garcia Abrego, but Abrego's capture by Mexican authorities in 1996 left a vacuum that no single man could immediately fill. Into that void stepped a carousel of interim leaders, each attempting to assert dominance and each struggling to manage the cartel's vast network. Osiel watched these developments closely. He was young, still in his 20s, but he understood that power rarely waited politely for someone to claim it. Cartel politics could be brutal, a mix of calculated alliances and sudden betrayals, and in that turbulence lay opportunity. He wasn't the most senior figure in the organization, but he had momentum and a growing base of loyal followers. The Gulf Cartel's leadership disputes often erupted into violence. Lieutenants jockeying for position would sabotage rivals' shipments or quietly feed information to law enforcement to weaken competitors. Osiel avoided making obvious enemies, preferring instead to operate in a way that seemed helpful to all factions. He became a problem solver, someone who could step in when routes were compromised or when corrupt officials suddenly demanded higher bribes. In a world where most players acted out of self-interest, Osiel's ability to appear neutral and indispensable gave him an edge. One example of this came when a major cocaine shipment vanished en route to the border. Two senior lieutenants blamed each other, and tensions threatened to explode into open conflict. Rather than choose a side, Osiel convened a discreet meeting, calmed tempers, and proposed a plan to recoup the lost profits through an accelerated smuggling schedule. The plan worked, earning him gratitude from both sides. It was the kind of quiet, competent intervention that made people start to see him not just as a talented operator, but as a potential leader. At the same time, Osiel was learning that leadership wasn't simply about solving problems. It was about cultivating loyalty. He made a point of taking care of the men under his command, offering them better pay, safer assignments, and a sense of purpose beyond just moving product. He understood that fear could enforce compliance, but true loyalty required respect. That ethos set him apart from many older cartel figures who ruled primarily through intimidation. Still, Osiel wasn't naive. He knew that goodwill alone wouldn't protect him if someone decided to remove him. He began to quietly build a personal security force, recruiting men with military or police training who could offer more sophisticated protection than the average gunman. This cadre would eventually become the nucleus of a group known as Los Zetas, but at this stage, they were simply bodyguards loyal to Osiel. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel deliberately laid the groundwork for Los Zetas as part of a long-term strategy, or whether the group evolved more organically as his need for security grew. Many people still think it was calculated, that he foresaw the potential of having elite enforcers at his disposal. Others believe he simply wanted the best protection possible in a dangerous environment, and only later realized how powerful such a unit could be. So what do you think? Was Osiel's creation of Los Zetas an act of foresight or a reaction to circumstance? Around this time, Osiel's reputation began to solidify not only within the Gulf Cartel, but also among rivals. He was known for being level-headed but decisive, someone who didn't bluff. When one rival faction attempted to undercut his operation by hijacking a shipment, Osiel reportedly responded with a targeted strike that eliminated the culprits without igniting a wider conflict. Word spread quickly. Cross Osiel, and you would face consequences. Yet, for all his growing influence, Osiel was careful not to appear as though he was openly angling for the top position. That would have made him a target for more established players. Instead, he positioned himself as the one who kept the machine running smoothly. If others fell, well, that wasn't his fault. It was just the natural order of things. The turning point came when two of the cartel's most senior figures were taken out in quick succession, one through a government raid and another in a suspicious ambush. With the leadership weakened, Osiel seized the moment. He convened his loyalists and presented a plan to stabilize operations. There was no grand speech, no declaration of intent. He simply took control of logistics, money flows, and security, and before long, he was effectively running the Gulf cartel. This quiet consolidation of power didn't go unnoticed. Some older members grumbled, resentful that a younger man had eclipsed them. But Osiel's ability to deliver profits and maintain order silenced much of the dissent. He had become the de facto leader of one of Mexico's most powerful criminal organizations. There's a story told among former cartel members that, after assuming control, Osiel gathered his men at a remote ranch and told them, "This is not about me. It's about the organization. If we don't stay united, they will pick us off one by one." Whether or not he actually said those words, the sentiment reflected how he viewed leadership. Survival required cohesion, but as Osiel settled into his new role, he was also aware that the forces aligned against him were growing stronger. Law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border were watching closely, and rivals were waiting for any sign of weakness. Osiel's leadership had brought stability, but it had also painted a target squarely on his back. By the close of the 1990s, the Gulf cartel was thriving again under his direction, its smuggling routes humming with activity. Yet, even as profits surged, Osiel couldn't shake the sense that danger was closing in. He had climbed higher than most dared dream, but at this altitude, the fall was always fatal. Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's position at the helm of the Gulf cartel was cemented not by any formal announcement, but by the quiet acceptance of his authority. Those who had doubted his staying power began to recognize that he had the rare combination of organizational skill, charisma, and decisiveness necessary to hold the cartel together. But leadership at that level was never without turbulence. At the turn of the millennium, Osiel faced constant challenges. Rivals both inside and outside the organization tested his resolve, probing for weaknesses. The Gulf cartel was lucrative, but it was also fragile, dependent on a web of relationships that could unravel quickly if not managed with care. Osiel spent much of his time consolidating power, ensuring that those who worked for him felt the benefits of loyalty and the costs of betrayal. This period was also defined by his expansion of Los Zetas, the enforcement arm he had begun assembling in the late 1990s. Originally conceived as his personal security force, Los Zetas consisted of former members of Mexico's elite special forces, men trained in advanced weaponry and tactics. Their presence transformed the Gulf cartel's operational capabilities. They weren't just bodyguards. They were shock troops who could neutralize rivals and intimidate entire communities. Many people still think Osiel's decision to recruit ex-soldiers was his greatest stroke of genius. It gave the Gulf cartel a level of discipline and firepower that no other organization could match at the time. But others argue that it planted the seeds of his eventual downfall, because Los Zetas would grow so powerful that even he struggled to control them. So what do you think? Was this a masterstroke of leadership or a fatal miscalculation? Osiel certainly recognized the value of their expertise. Under his guidance, Los Zetas orchestrated carefully planned strikes against rival cartels, taking control of contested routes and eliminating threats with ruthless efficiency. Their tactics were unlike anything Mexico's criminal landscape had seen before, and they quickly earned a reputation for brutality. Communities whispered about the men in black uniforms, who arrived silently and left only after making their message unmistakably clear. At the same time, Osiel understood the importance of maintaining alliances with local authorities. Corruption had long been a cornerstone of the cartel's survival, and he invested heavily in ensuring that police officers, politicians, and even members of the military remained on his payroll. He often used intermediaries to deliver bribes, but those who received the payments knew exactly whose favor they were enjoying. This network of influence allowed Osiel to operate with relative impunity, at least for a time. His growing power also brought a shift in his lifestyle. Osiel, once the wiry young man darting between vendors in Matamoros, now occupied sprawling mansions equipped with private pools, luxury cars, and state-of-the-art security systems. Lavish parties became a fixture, with musicians flown in to entertain guests and champagne flowing freely. These displays of wealth served both as personal indulgence and as a signal to friends and foes alike. The Gulf cartel was thriving, but Osiel wasn't entirely blinded by luxury. He still returned to his old neighborhoods occasionally, distributing gifts to local families and ensuring that the community saw him as a benefactor. This practice brought a degree of loyalty and silence, as many residents were reluctant to provide information to law enforcement about someone who had put food on their tables. Meanwhile, the United States was increasing its pressure on Mexican traffickers. Agencies like the DEA and FBI had grown frustrated with the Gulf cartel's ability to evade justice, and joint operations with Mexican authorities became more frequent. Osiel knew he was on their radar, but he believed his network of corruption would insulate him. There's a story from this era that illustrates his growing confidence, and perhaps overconfidence. In 1999, Osiel confronted 2 U.S. federal agents who had entered Matamoros to meet with an informant. According to reports, he personally blocked their vehicle and threatened to kill them. Even as they identified themselves, the agents were released, but the incident caused an uproar in Washington and led to a multi-agency effort to bring Osiel down. This bold move, while it reinforced his image as a fearless leader, also painted an even larger target on his back. The confrontation with the agents was a turning point. U.S. authorities placed Osiel at the top of their most wanted lists, and Mexican officials, under pressure, could no longer afford to ignore his activities. Suddenly, the web of corruption he had relied on began to show signs of fraying. Trusted allies in law enforcement became liabilities, and Osiel was forced to operate with greater caution. Inside the cartel, his grip was strong, but cracks were beginning to appear. Los Zetas, emboldened by their growing reputation, sometimes acted independently, carrying out operations without Osiel's explicit approval. He valued their capabilities, but worried about their autonomy. Some whispered that the enforcers were becoming a power unto themselves, less an extension of Osiel's will, and more a parallel organization. Scholars often debate whether Osiel fully understood the danger posed by Los Zetas at this stage. Some argue that he believed he could keep them loyal through a mix of money and shared interests. Others suggest he was simply too focused on external threats, law enforcement, rivals, and political pressure to address the internal storm brewing. One thing was clear. Osiel's leadership style, a blend of pragmatism and calculated risk, was being tested like never before. He had built an empire that spanned borders and commanded billions in revenue. But the forces aligned against him were growing more sophisticated and relentless. By the early 2000s, Osiel's world had become a high-stakes balancing act. He was trying to manage a cartel that had grown almost too large to control, an enforcement wing that was edging toward independence, and an international manhunt that was closing in with each passing month. He still projected confidence at meetings, often joking with his lieutenants and reassuring them that the Gulf Cartel's position was unassailable. But behind closed doors, the weight of leadership was taking its toll. He slept lightly, constantly changing safe houses, and relied more than ever on the men of Los Zetas to shield him from threats. Even so, Osiel couldn't ignore the sense that his time at the top might be limited. Every cartel leader knew the cycle: rise, rule, fall. The only question was how long he could defy it. The formation of Los Zetas had been one of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's most decisive moves, and by the early 2000s, the group was rapidly transforming the Gulf Cartel's operational structure. What had begun as a personal security detail now operated like a precision strike unit made up of ex-military men with a level of training that outclassed traditional cartel enforcers. They wore black tactical gear, moved with practiced efficiency, and wielded sophisticated weapons that rivaled those of government forces. Osiel relied on Los Zetas not just for protection, but for expanding the cartel's influence. They became the tip of the spear, used to intimidate rivals, seize contested territory, and enforce discipline within the organization. Their methods were chillingly effective. Stories spread of Zeta operatives surrounding entire neighborhoods, dragging out those who crossed the cartel and leaving behind gruesome warnings. Communities quickly learned not to resist. This combination of discipline and terror gave Osiel unprecedented control. Rivals feared Los Zetas, and even his own lieutenants understood that disloyalty could bring swift retribution. Yet, the very strength of Los Zetas also carried inherent risks. Many people still think that Osiel's dependence on them sowed the seeds of his eventual downfall. The men he recruited were not ordinary thugs. They were ambitious, well-trained, and accustomed to operating independently. At first, Osiel believed that money and shared purpose would keep them loyal. He paid them well and gave them access to resources that most criminals could only dream of. But some scholars argue that he underestimated their ambitions. Los Zetas began to develop their own identity, separate from the Gulf Cartel. They had their own leaders, their own structure, and a growing appetite for power. Meanwhile, Osiel was becoming more visible. His leadership brought stability and profitability, but it also attracted attention from authorities. The 1999 incident in which he threatened U.S. federal agents had turned him into a top priority for both the DEA and Mexican law enforcement. Joint task forces formed with the explicit goal of dismantling the Gulf Cartel and capturing its elusive leader. Osiel tried to counter this growing pressure by expanding his network of corruption. He funneled money to politicians, police chiefs, and military commanders, ensuring that he received early warnings of planned raids. This strategy had worked in the past, but the level of scrutiny he now faced made it harder to maintain airtight protection. Allies who once shielded him were themselves being investigated or replaced by officials less willing to take bribes. The increased pressure also forced Osiel into a more reclusive lifestyle. He rarely stayed in one place for long, rotating between safe houses in Matamoros, Reynosa, and smaller rural towns. These hideouts were fortified and staffed by loyal Zeta operatives, but the constant movement took its toll. Sleep became fitful, meals hurried, and trust harder to come by. Yet, even as the walls closed in, Osiel projected confidence. He continued to oversee cartel operations with meticulous attention to detail, approving shipments, negotiating alliances, and resolving disputes. He attended meetings with an air of calm authority, never letting his lieutenants see the strain he was under. It was during this period that Osiel began exploring new avenues for expanding the Gulf Cartel's reach. He sought alliances with other criminal organizations, both in Mexico and abroad, to secure additional smuggling routes and diversify the cartel's revenue streams. Some of these negotiations succeeded, while others led to increased tensions with rival cartels, particularly the Sinaloa Federation, which was growing more aggressive under Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel's outreach to other cartels was a sign of strength or desperation. Was he seeking to build a more formidable network, or was he simply trying to hedge his bets as pressure mounted? So what do you think? Was this strategic foresight, or a sign that Osiel sensed his grip slipping? What's clear is that the early 2000s were a pivotal period for Osiel. Los Zetas gave him unprecedented power, but they were also becoming increasingly independent. Authorities on both sides of the border were devoting massive resources to capturing him, and his once reliable network of corruption was fraying under the strain. Despite these challenges, Osiel remained focused on projecting an image of control. He still attended lavish gatherings at secure ranches, where musicians played late into the night and lieutenants toasted his leadership. These events were as much about morale as indulgence. They reminded everyone that the Gulf Cartel was still strong, even as the noose tightened. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Los Zetas, once unquestioningly loyal, were starting to operate with a degree of autonomy that worried Osiel. Some missions were carried out without his direct approval, and rumors circulated that certain Zeta leaders were quietly building their own networks. Osiel dismissed these whispers publicly, but in private, he confided to a trusted associate that control is a delicate thing. You can feel it slipping before anyone else notices. By 2002, the Gulf Cartel had reached the height of its power under Osiel's leadership. It controlled key smuggling routes, commanded one of the most feared enforcement arms in criminal history, and generated staggering profits. Yet, even at this peak, the seeds of internal discord and external pressure were sprouting, and though Osiel could not have known it, the final act of his story was already being set in motion. By 2002, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén was arguably the most powerful criminal figure along Mexico's northeastern border. The Gulf Cartel's network of smuggling routes extended deep into Texas and beyond, funneling vast quantities of cocaine, marijuana, and other drugs into the United States. Profits soared into the billions, and Osiel sat at the center of it all. Yet, as his empire flourished, so did the pressures that threatened to unravel it. Los Zetas, the elite enforcement arm he had created, had become both his greatest asset and his most complex challenge. They carried out missions with a precision that made rival cartels hesitate before encroaching on Gulf Cartel territory. They could storm safe houses, ambush rivals, and intimidate entire communities in a single evening. Their reputation for brutality was legendary, and their mere presence was often enough to quell dissent. But that reputation came at a cost. Los Zetas operated with a level of autonomy that worried Osiel. Their leaders, men like Heriberto Lascano and Miguel Trevino Morales, were ambitious, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to each other. Osiel understood that maintaining control over them required a delicate balance of respect, fear and financial incentives. He increased their pay and granted them greater authority, hoping these concessions would reinforce loyalty. Still, rumors began to circulate that Los Zetas were pursuing independent interests. Some missions were reportedly conducted without Osiel's explicit approval, and there were whispers that they were cultivating their own smuggling networks. Many people still think that Osiel underestimated how much power Los Zetas could accumulate. He saw them as enforcers, but they were becoming something more, a parallel organization with its own ambitions. Meanwhile, external threats were intensifying. U.S. and Mexican authorities were coordinating joint operations aimed at dismantling the Gulf cartel's infrastructure. The 1999 incident in which Osiel had threatened U.S. federal agents remained fresh in the minds of American law enforcement, and they were determined to capture him. Mexican officials, facing immense pressure from Washington, began purging corrupt officers and replacing them with individuals less susceptible to bribery. This shift eroded one of Osiel's key defenses, his ability to neutralize threats through corruption. He could no longer rely on advance warnings of raids, and some of his most trusted contacts were suddenly unavailable, or worse, cooperating with investigators. He responded by becoming more reclusive, rotating between fortified safe houses and limiting his inner circle to those he trusted completely. But even as he retreated from public view, Osiel continued to project strength. He convened meetings with lieutenants to reassure them that the Gulf cartel was unshaken. These gatherings often took place at remote ranches guarded by Los Zetas, where Osiel would preside over lavish feasts. He was careful to maintain the appearance of a man in control, even as the walls around him seemed to close in. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel truly believed he could outmaneuver the growing pressure or whether he was simply buying time. Some argue that he was already preparing contingency plans, including potential escapes to other countries. Others believe that his ego, bolstered by years of success, convinced him that he could weather any storm. So what do you think? Was Osiel realistic about the danger he faced, or was he blinded by his own power? The Gulf cartel's enemies were not limited to law enforcement. Rival cartels, particularly the Sinaloa Federation under Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, were probing for weaknesses. Battles for control of smuggling routes intensified, leading to outbreaks of violence that left civilians caught in the crossfire. Osiel ordered Los Zetas to respond with overwhelming force, and they did, sometimes with tactics so brutal that they shocked even seasoned cartel observers. These conflicts solidified Los Zetas' fearsome reputation, but they also contributed to a growing sense that the group was becoming untethered from Osiel's direct control. They developed their own intelligence networks, independently negotiated with local gangs, and even experimented with new revenue streams like extortion and kidnapping. While these activities enriched the cartel as a whole, they also gave Los Zetas financial independence. Internally, some of Osiel's older lieutenants voiced concerns. They worried that the enforcement arm had become too powerful and that their loyalty to Osiel might waver if it conflicted with their own ambitions. Osiel listened but was reluctant to confront Los Zetas directly. He understood that alienating them could lead to open conflict, something the Gulf cartel could not afford while facing mounting external threats. By late 2002, Osiel's life had become a cycle of constant vigilance. He changed vehicles frequently, traveled with heavily armed convoys, and rarely stayed in one place more than a few nights. Sleep was elusive, interrupted by the hum of security radios and the distant sound of gunfire. Those closest to him said he had grown more paranoid, questioning the loyalty of even longtime allies. Yet, in public, he maintained his image as a confident, untouchable leader. He still made calculated appearances at social events, flashing the same easy smile that had charmed people since his youth in Matamoros. He believed that showing fear would invite weakness, and weakness was a luxury he could not afford. But privately, Osiel knew the stakes had never been higher. The Gulf Cartel's empire was vast, but it was also fragile, dependent on the loyalty of men like those in Los Zetas and the complicity of officials who could turn at any moment. One betrayal could undo everything he had built, and unbeknownst to Osiel, that betrayal was already taking shape. By early 2003, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's world was teetering on a knife's edge. The Gulf Cartel remained immensely powerful, its drug corridors humming with activity, and its revenue streams unmatched by most rival organizations. Yet, the infrastructure supporting this empire had grown brittle. Authorities on both sides of the border were closing in. Rival cartels were challenging his dominance, and Los Zetas, the elite enforcement arm Osiel had built, were becoming increasingly autonomous. This period marked the height of Osiel's smuggling operations into the United States. Convoys of tractor-trailers, hidden compartments in commercial shipping containers, and light aircraft coursed through carefully coordinated routes. These operations were vast in scale, moving thousands of kilos of cocaine and marijuana monthly. Profits surged, but the sheer size of the operation also made it more vulnerable. Any single misstep could cost millions, and mistakes were becoming harder to avoid. Despite this, Osiel was still seen as the Gulf Cartel's unifying force. He projected confidence during meetings with lieutenants, often laughing easily, joking about his ability to outmaneuver authorities, and brushing off rumors about internal instability. But beneath the surface, he understood that the cartel was a delicate machine, one that required constant maintenance. Los Zetas were both his greatest asset and his most pressing concern. They had grown bolder, carrying out operations without always seeking his approval. Their leaders, Heriberto Lascano and Miguel Trevino Morales, were no longer merely his employees. They commanded loyalty from their own subordinates, and their influence stretched across multiple territories. Many people still think that Osiel realized too late how much independence he had ceded to them. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel believed he could rein Los Zetas back in, or whether he had already resigned himself to their autonomy. Some argue that he thought their ambitions aligned closely enough with his own that direct confrontation was unnecessary. Others suggest he feared that challenging them would spark a violent schism that could shatter the Gulf Cartel. So what do you think? Was Osiel pragmatic, or was he simply afraid of the monster he had created? Meanwhile, external pressure was mounting. U.S. agencies like the DEA, FBI, and Border Patrol were coordinating intelligence with Mexico's military and federal police. Joint task forces conducted raids on suspected cartel safe houses, warehouses, and stash points. High-value arrests disrupted the cartel's supply chain and eroded the sense of impunity Osiel had long cultivated. Even more damaging was the gradual dismantling of his corruption network. Allies within law enforcement were being rotated out or arrested, cutting off the advance warnings that had allowed him to stay ahead of raids. Osiel was forced to retreat deeper into the shadows, relying heavily on Los Zetas to secure his movements and manage day-to-day cartel operations. Despite these challenges, Osiel maintained a lavish lifestyle. He hosted gatherings at ranches and villas, complete with live bands, gourmet meals, and flowing alcohol. These events were not mere indulgences. They were strategic, designed to reinforce his image as a leader in full control. Lieutenants and foot soldiers alike were reminded that their loyalty to Osiel came with tangible rewards, but cracks were forming. Some lieutenants, resentful of Los Zetas' growing power, began quietly questioning whether Osiel still had complete authority. Others feared that his increasingly reclusive behavior was a sign of weakness. Osiel sensed these doubts and tried to address them through decisive action. One such action involved reasserting control over contested smuggling routes in Tamaulipas. Rival gangs, emboldened by rumors of internal discord, had attempted to seize control of border crossings. Osiel ordered a sweeping response. Los Zetas descended on the disputed territory with overwhelming force, killing several rivals and leaving behind unmistakable warnings. The message was clear. The Gulf Cartel was still firmly in control, yet this show of strength only deepened Osiel's dependence on Los Zetas. Their ability to carry out such operations with surgical precision made them indispensable, but it also highlighted how much of the cartel's muscle resided outside of his direct command. As 2003 progressed, Osiel grew increasingly cautious. He moved between fortified safe houses, each one more remote than the last. He traveled with heavily armed convoys, sometimes switching vehicles multiple times a day to throw off surveillance. His world shrank to a tight circle of trusted lieutenants and Zeta bodyguards. Those close to him noticed a change. The once confident leader who had laughed easily now appeared more serious, his jokes fewer, his expressions harder to read. He spent long hours on the phone, managing cartel logistics and trying to anticipate threats. Many people still think that Osiel's growing paranoia was justified. He had made powerful enemies, and his capture had become a top priority for U.S. and Mexican authorities alike. But others argue that his reclusiveness fueled the very instability he feared. Lieutenants who rarely saw their leader began to wonder whether he was still capable of protecting them. What Osiel could not see, or perhaps refused to fully acknowledge, was that betrayal was lurking closer than he realized. Some of the people he trusted most were already in contact with authorities, feeding them information about his movements. These betrayals would soon set in motion the manhunt that would end his reign. For now, though, Osiel continued to believe he could maintain control. He tightened security, avoided unnecessary risks, and leaned ever more heavily on Los Zetas. But in doing so, he was making himself increasingly isolated, a dangerous position for a man who once built his power by understanding and manipulating the people around him. An isolation, in the world Osiel inhabited, was a precursor to disaster. By mid-2003, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's empire was as fortified as it was fragile. He commanded the Gulf Cartel's sprawling network from behind layers of security, rotating between heavily guarded safe houses in Tamaulipas and nearby rural areas. Yet, even as his fortified world expanded in physical defenses, it was shrinking in terms of trust. He relied on a dwindling number of lieutenants and Los Zetas operatives, knowing that any one of them could be the weak link that brought it all down. Osiel had long understood that betrayal was the default currency in cartel politics, but now the paranoia felt closer, more tangible. He kept meetings short and avoided predictable routines. He changed his cell phones constantly, carried encrypted radios, and often used decoys to throw off surveillance. Those close to him noticed how his easy laugh had faded into tight smiles, and how he increasingly spoke in clipped, deliberate sentences. Externally, the Gulf Cartel still projected dominance. Los Zetas' tactical operations remained unmatched, and rival cartels hesitated before challenging Osiel's control of Tamaulipas. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Los Zetas had evolved into an entity with its own interests. Their leaders, Heriberto Lascano and Miguel Trevino Morales, commanded fierce loyalty from their men, who were motivated as much by allegiance to the Zeta brand as by loyalty to Osiel himself. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel ever truly had full control over Los Zetas, or if they were always destined to chart their own course. Some believe that by recruiting elite soldiers, he had created a group too disciplined and independent to remain subordinate indefinitely. Others argue that it was his growing reclusiveness that ceded too much autonomy. So what do you think? Did Osiel lose control, or had he never really possessed it? Even within the Gulf Cartel's broader leadership structure, doubts were creeping in. Lieutenants who had once looked to Osiel for stability now whispered that he had become overly dependent on Los Zetas to solve problems. This perception was dangerous. Cartel leaders couldn't afford to appear weak, and Osiel knew it. To counter these doubts, Osiel sought to reaffirm his authority through decisive action. When intelligence indicated that a rival group was attempting to infiltrate one of the Gulf Cartel's key smuggling corridors, he ordered a swift and brutal response. Los Zetas swept into the contested area with lethal efficiency, eliminating the threat and leaving behind the unmistakable message that the Gulf Cartel remained firmly in control. But even victories like these came with complications. Los Zetas' ability to execute such operations only reinforced their importance and their independence. They had become the muscle that underpinned the Gulf Cartel's power, and Osiel couldn't ignore the fact that they might one day decide they no longer needed him. Meanwhile, law enforcement pressure was intensifying. Joint U.S.-Mexico operations had begun targeting Osiel's financial networks, freezing assets, and arresting key money launderers. These moves disrupted the steady flow of cash that had long fueled his corruption machine. Officials who had once been easily bought were now harder to sway, either because they feared getting caught or because the money simply wasn't reaching them. The DEA and Mexican military were also receiving increasingly precise intelligence about Osiel's movements. This wasn't coincidence. Someone close to him was leaking information, but identifying the source was nearly impossible in an organization as sprawling as the Gulf Cartel. Osiel responded by tightening his inner circle further, a move that, ironically, made him even more dependent on Los Zetas. Many people still think that Osiel's isolation at this stage made him vulnerable. By limiting his contact with lieutenants, he inadvertently weakened the personal bonds that had once secured their loyalty. Some felt sidelined, even mistrusted, and in the volatile world of cartel politics, resentment could easily morph into betrayal. Despite these mounting challenges, Osiel maintained a veneer of confidence. He continued to host gatherings at secure ranches, complete with music and lavish meals, as though nothing had changed. These events served as a reminder that the Gulf Cartel remained flush with money and power. Yet even during these gatherings, Osiel was surrounded by armed Zeta operatives, their presence a silent acknowledgement that danger lurked everywhere. One close associate later recalled how Osiel would walk the perimeter of these gatherings, scanning faces for any sign of disloyalty. He trusted people less and less, the associate said. He thought if he could just keep watching, he would see it coming. But in this world, betrayal doesn't announce itself. By late 2003, the circle was tightening. Authorities had narrowed their focus to the Matamoros-Reynosa corridor, convinced that Osiel was hiding somewhere within this region. They increased patrols, launched surprise raids, and used surveillance drones and informants to map out his movements. Osiel was aware of the manhunt, but he believed his security measures would keep him safe. After all, He had eluded capture for years, slipping through raids and evading traps that had ensnared other cartel leaders. But this time, the pressure was different. The intelligence coming in was too specific, the timing of raids too precise. Someone in his orbit was feeding his enemies exactly what they needed, and that betrayal, though invisible, was about to lead Osiel into the deadliest trap of his life. By the winter of 2003, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén was living as if every day could be his last. The Gulf cartel remained immensely profitable, with tons of cocaine and marijuana moving north and billions of dollars flowing south. But the empire he had built was beginning to feel less like a fortress and more like a labyrinth closing in on him. He had long understood the necessity of unpredictability, but now his life revolved around it. He rarely spent more than 2 nights in the same safe house. Convoys of heavily armed Los Zetas escorted him wherever he went, their vehicles shifting formations constantly to avoid patterns. These precautions kept him alive, but they also wore him down. He was sleeping less, eating less, and trusting almost no one. Meanwhile, U.S. and Mexican authorities had ramped up joint efforts to capture him. Teams of DEA agents, FBI investigators, and Mexican Marines worked around the clock to track his movements. The 1999 confrontation with U.S. federal agents had marked him as a priority target, and the task force believed his arrest would be a symbolic and strategic victory in the war on drugs. What Osiel didn't know was that someone close to him was feeding these task forces information. Each time he relocated, each time he met with lieutenants, details were quietly funneled to the authorities. The intelligence allowed them to map his movements with unsettling accuracy. Many people still think about who that betrayer truly was. Was it a disillusioned lieutenant, tired of Osiel's paranoia? A member of Los Zetas who saw more opportunity in his fall? Or perhaps someone outside his inner circle entirely? Scholars and investigators still debate the answer, though most agree that at least one source came from within. So what do you think? Was Osiel doomed by an inevitable traitor, or by his inability to see who was truly loyal? Despite the growing sense of danger, Osiel maintained appearances. He still convened meetings at secure ranches, still played the role of an unshakable leader. At one such meeting, he reportedly reassured his lieutenants that the Gulf cartel's enemies were always 2 steps behind, a line delivered with the trademark smile that once inspired confidence. But some of those in attendance later admitted they saw a flicker of strain behind his eyes. Los Zetas continued to serve as his shield and his sword, carrying out targeted strikes against rivals and keeping law enforcement at bay. Yet their growing autonomy gnawed at Osiel. He knew they had the power to act independently, and their leaders were ambitious men with ambitions of their own. At times, he considered reining them in, perhaps even purging those he suspected of overreaching. But such a move risked civil war within the cartel, a scenario that could shatter the entire operation. Instead, Osiel doubled down on the tactics that had always worked for him: caution, compartmentalization, and control. He made fewer personal appearances at operational hubs, preferring to issue directives through trusted intermediaries. This insulated him from potential raids, but also deepened his isolation. Law enforcement pressure was unrelenting. Mexican military units conducted surprise raids on stash houses and warehouses linked to the Gulf cartel, seizing drugs, cash, and weapons. U.S. authorities targeted his financial networks, freezing accounts and seizing assets. These blows, while not fatal, disrupted the smooth flow of money that Osiel relied upon to maintain loyalty among corrupt officials. There's an open scholarly debate. about whether these coordinated attacks genuinely weakened Osiel, or whether they simply accelerated his paranoia. Some argue that his organization remained robust, and that the real threat came from the growing independence of Los Zetas. Others contend that the combined law enforcement pressure eroded his power base so thoroughly that betrayal became inevitable. What's clear is that Osiel's once iron grip was loosening. He sensed it, even if he wouldn't admit it publicly. Trusted lieutenants were growing restless, worried about the heightened scrutiny and the potential consequences of staying too close to a man so relentlessly hunted. In the midst of this tension, Osiel made a fateful decision. He would move to a new safe house closer to Matamoros, believing it offered better access to escape routes should a raid occur. It seemed like a practical move, the kind he had made countless times before. But unknown to Osiel, the authorities already knew of his plan. As he prepared for the relocation, his security protocols became even more intense. Convoys were doubled, safe houses were swept for surveillance devices, and decoy vehicles were deployed to mislead potential pursuers. Yet no amount of planning could shield him from the betrayal that had already set the stage for his capture. On the surface, Osiel still projected the image of a man in control. He hosted a final meeting at one of his ranches, giving orders for upcoming shipments and praising Los Zetas for their effectiveness. But as he left the gathering that night, he reportedly told a close associate, "Something feels off. Too many eyes on us." He was right. Within days, the circle would close. The final days before Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's capture carried a strange, almost cinematic tension. For years, he had lived with the knowledge that every decision could be the one that brought him down. But now that danger felt sharper, closer, as if someone were constantly watching from just beyond the horizon. He couldn't name the betrayer or point to a single moment of failure, but the unease gnawed at him all the same. On paper, the Gulf cartel was still an efficient machine. Drugs were crossing the border in staggering quantities, money was flowing steadily, and Los Zetas maintained their stranglehold on Tamaulipas. Yet, Osiel knew that appearances could be deceiving. He had survived long enough to recognize the subtle signs of erosion. A lieutenant hesitating before giving an answer, a safe house door that seemed just a little too easy to breach, and a growing number of whispers about law enforcement raids that were hitting closer and closer to his inner circle. The betrayal, though invisible, had a clear impact. U.S. and Mexican authorities were now working with an unprecedented level of precision. They seemed to know exactly where and when to strike, and they were no longer just targeting stash houses or minor operatives. The noose was tightening around Osiel himself. He responded by tightening his world even further. Meetings became smaller, shorter, and more secretive. Communication lines were restricted, and even some long-time lieutenants found themselves excluded from decisions. This insularity, while understandable, bred resentment. Men who had once been fiercely loyal began to feel alienated, and in cartel politics, alienation often led to betrayal. Many people still think that Osiel's downfall was inevitable the moment he began isolating himself. Scholars debate whether he could have salvaged his position by taking a different approach, perhaps by bringing Los Zetas closer, rather than keeping them at arm's length. So, what do you think? Would greater trust have saved him? Or would it only have accelerated the betrayal? As Osiel prepared for another move to a new safe house near Matamoros, he was meticulous. He ordered extensive surveillance of the surrounding area, employed decoys to mislead potential pursuers, and rotated vehicles to avoid patterns. His convoy included heavily armed Zeta operatives, each one trained to repel an ambush. But the intelligence being fed to authorities rendered much of this moot. U.S. and Mexican law enforcement agencies knew exactly where Osiel was headed and when. Joint task forces quietly staged themselves for the strike, positioning ground units, air support, and rapid response teams along likely escape routes. For Osiel, it was just another relocation, one of dozens he had made before. He was accustomed to this rhythm: pack quickly, move quietly, and settle in behind layers of security. But those closest to him sensed that something about this move felt different. He seemed distracted, restless, as though he could sense the trap closing. Los Zetas provided their usual blanket of security, but even their confidence was starting to fray. Some operatives privately questioned whether their leader could continue to evade capture indefinitely. Others quietly speculated about what would happen to them if Osiel were arrested or killed. Still, outwardly, Osiel maintained his composure. At the final operational meeting before the move, he issued instructions with the same calm authority that had carried him through countless crises. He reminded his lieutenants of their responsibilities, emphasized the importance of discipline, and warned that any sign of disloyalty would be dealt with harshly. Then, with a wry smile, he told them, "If they want me, they'll have to earn it." The convoy departed under cover of darkness, winding through back roads that avoided major highways. Osiel traveled in an armored SUV surrounded by Zeta vehicles, each bristling with weapons and staffed by men who could repel most attacks. But what he couldn't see was that the authorities had anticipated every step of the route. The joint task force tracking him had been patient, waiting for the right moment when they could strike with overwhelming force. And now, with Osiel on the move and isolated from his broader support network, that moment had arrived. In the days leading up to the operation, U.S. and Mexican officials coordinated with a level of precision rarely seen in cross-border law enforcement efforts. They staged personnel along potential escape routes and deployed aircraft equipped with thermal imaging to monitor the convoy's progress. Osiel, unaware of the trap, likely believed that his security protocols would carry him through as they always had. After all, he had survived countless close calls before. But this time, the betrayals within his network had stripped away the layers of protection that once shielded him. By the time the convoy neared its destination, the trap was fully set. Mexican military units, supported by federal police and guided by U.S. intelligence, were already closing in from multiple directions. What Osiel didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the operation was no longer about surveillance or intimidation. This was the strike they had been planning for months, the one designed to end his reign once and for all. The trap was sprung in the dead of night as Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's convoy wound its way along a narrow stretch of rural highway outside Matamoros. It was the kind of road that barely existed on maps, bordered by scrub brush and wide-open fields, a perfect place for a man like Osiel to vanish or to be cornered. The convoy was formidable by any standard. Armored SUVs, bristling with heavily armed Los Zetas operatives, rolled in tight formation. Each vehicle carried men who had been trained to repel ambushes, to neutralize threats in seconds. They believed they could fight their way out of anything. And in the past, they had. But this time was different. The intelligence feeding the joint task force tracking Osiel had given them the upper hand. Mexican military units, federal police, and U.S. intelligence assets had been carefully positioned along every conceivable escape route. Roadblocks were set just beyond sight lines, helicopters loitered high above, and quick reaction teams lay hidden in the surrounding terrain. As Osiel's convoy approached the designated kill zone, the traps snapped shut. A sudden barrage of spotlights illuminated the highway, blinding drivers and forcing the lead SUV to swerve. Armored vehicles blocked the road ahead and behind, sealing the convoy in. Gunfire erupted almost instantly, a deafening roar that cut through the night. Los Zetas responded with the same lethal efficiency that had made them legendary. They dismounted quickly, firing at the encroaching forces with automatic rifles and grenades. Their training was evident. They used cover, coordinated their movements, and managed to inflict casualties even as the situation deteriorated. But they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The government's forces had anticipated every defensive tactic and were pressing their advantage relentlessly. Inside one of the SUVs, Osiel remained remarkably calm, even as bullets pinged off the armored plating. He had survived raids before. He knew the drill: stay low, stay alive, and wait for Los Zetas to carve a path out. But as the minutes dragged on and the convoy remained pinned, it became clear that escape was slipping out of reach. Many people still think about the choice Osiel made in those critical moments. Should he have attempted to fight his way through, even at the cost of his life? Or was surrender the only viable option? Scholars debate whether his decision was one of pragmatism or defeat. So what do you think? Was Osiel's final move a calculated survival tactic, or the inevitable concession of a man who knew he was beaten? The firefight raged on, but the tide was turning against the Gulf Cartel's leader. Helicopters overhead relayed his exact position to ground units, who advanced methodically, overwhelming Los Zetas one sector at a time. Those operatives who weren't killed were captured, stripped of their weapons, and forced to the ground. Realizing the futility of further resistance, Osiel ordered the surviving Zetas to hold their fire. Emerging from the SUV with his hands raised, he was met by a wall of soldiers and federal police officers. The arrest was swift and clinical. Within minutes, Osiel was disarmed, restrained, and bundled into a waiting vehicle. The capture was a major victory for both Mexican and U.S. authorities. After years of pursuit, one of the hemisphere's most powerful and elusive drug lords was finally in custody. News of the arrest spread rapidly, sending shock waves through the criminal underworld and across the Gulf Cartel's network. But even as they celebrated, some law enforcement officials wondered what the long-term consequences might be. Removing a figure as central as Osiel could destabilize the organization in unpredictable ways. And then there was Los Zetas, a paramilitary force accustomed to operating with autonomy, now facing the prospect of life without their leader. Many people still think that the arrest marked the beginning of a darker chapter for Mexico's drug war. Without Osiel's centralized authority, the Gulf Cartel fractured, and Los Zetas soon emerged as an independent cartel, unleashing a wave of violence that would eclipse even the brutal reign of their former boss. For Osiel, however, the immediate reality was stark. He was transported under heavy guard to a secure detention facility where he was placed in isolation. The man who had once commanded armies of enforcers now found himself confined to a small cell, stripped of the power and influence that had defined his life for decades. But this was only the beginning of his legal battles. U.S. prosecutors were already preparing to seek his extradition, determined to bring him to trial in American courts. Osiel knew that if he were sent north, the chances of ever seeing freedom again were slim. And so, even as the cell door clanged shut behind him, his mind was already racing, searching for some way to regain control of a life that had slipped from his grasp. Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's capture was a seismic moment. But for him, it was only the start of a new and more uncertain battle. Once safely in custody, Mexican authorities moved him to a high-security prison, aware that any lapse could result in a daring rescue attempt by Los Zetas. The man who had once orchestrated empires from fortified safe houses now found himself behind layers of steel bars and watchful eyes. Stripped of the freedom he had worked so ruthlessly to protect, prison life was an adjustment Osiel never fully embraced. Accustomed to luxury, power, and constant movement, he now faced the monotony of strict schedules and constant surveillance. Yet, even from behind bars, he remained a figure of immense influence. Guards and fellow inmates knew who he was, and many treated him with the deference reserved for someone whose reach could still extend beyond prison walls. Outside the prison, the Gulf Cartel reeled from the loss of its leader. Lieutenants jockeyed for control, and the organization's once cohesive structure began to fracture. Los Zetas, the enforcement arm that Osiel had created, found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. No longer tethered to his direct authority, they began to act independently, pursuing their own interests with increasing boldness. Many people still think that Osiel's arrest was the spark that ignited the eventual schism between the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas. Without a central figure capable of balancing competing interests, the cartel splintered into factions. Los Zetas, armed with military training and an appetite for expansion, would soon transform into one of Mexico's most violent and feared criminal organizations. From his cell, Osiel tried to maintain some semblance of control. He passed instructions through trusted intermediaries, hoping to influence decisions on the outside. But the truth was inescapable. His grip on the cartel was slipping. Power had shifted to those still free, and Osiel's orders carried less weight with each passing day. At the same time, U.S. prosecutors moved swiftly to secure his extradition. The 1999 confrontation with U.S. federal agents in Matamoros had made Osiel a high-priority target, and American authorities were determined to bring him to trial. Mexican officials, under intense pressure, prepared the legal framework for extradition, aware that Osiel's presence in their prisons posed significant risks. There's an open, scholarly debate about whether extraditing Osiel to the United States was the best course of action. Some argue that keeping him in Mexico would have allowed for better intelligence gathering and reduced the likelihood of violent retaliation from his followers. Others believe that American courts offered the only realistic chance of securing a conviction and ensuring he remained behind bars for life. So what do you think? Would Mexico have been better off keeping Osiel within its borders, or was extradition inevitable? As the legal proceedings unfolded, Osiel reportedly explored every avenue to delay or prevent extradition. Lawyers filed motions, challenged evidence, and appealed to sympathetic officials. But these efforts only bought time. The U.S. government was relentless, and the case against him was ironclad. Within the prison, Osiel's world narrowed further. Guards monitored his communications closely, intercepting letters and scrutinizing visitors. Los Zetas, meanwhile, continued to evolve into a force unto themselves. Their leaders, Heriberto Lascano and Miguel Treviño Morales, expanded their influence beyond Tamaulipas, venturing into new territories and diversifying their criminal enterprises. Many of Osiel's former lieutenants struggled to adapt to this new reality. Some attempted to fill the vacuum he left behind, but none possessed his combination of charisma, strategic thinking, and authority. Infighting escalated as factions battled for dominance, weakening the Gulf Cartel's once formidable grip on smuggling routes. From his cell, Osiel could only watch as the empire he had built began to crumble. He was still feared, still respected, But fear and respect alone could not hold together an organization as vast and volatile as the Gulf Cartel. He had always believed that leadership was about cohesion, about ensuring that everyone, from top lieutenants to street-level operatives, felt invested in the organization's survival. Now that cohesion was evaporating, by late 2003, the extradition process was all but certain. Osiel's attorneys prepared their final appeals, but even they understood the odds were slim. American authorities wanted him in their custody, and once that transfer happened, there would be no turning back. In the quiet of his cell, Osiel contemplated the decisions that had brought him to this point. He thought about Los Zetas and whether he had made a mistake by empowering them so completely. He thought about the betrayals that had led to his capture, wondering who had betrayed him and why he hadn't seen it coming. And he thought about the empire that was slipping through his fingers, piece by piece, as he sat behind bars. But even in these moments of introspection, Osiel was not a man resigned to defeat. He had survived too much to simply accept his fate. He continued to scheme, to plan, to imagine scenarios in which he could regain some measure of control. Yet deep down, he must have known that his era as the undisputed leader of the Gulf Cartel was over. The months following Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's capture were a blur of legal maneuvers, prison routines, and mounting uncertainty. He remained in Mexican custody, but the prospect of extradition to the United States loomed larger each day. U.S. prosecutors had compiled a devastating case, and they were unrelenting in their push to bring Osiel north, where a federal trial would likely lead to a life sentence. Osiel's attorneys fought tooth and nail to delay the process. They challenged evidence, claimed violations of his rights, and argued that he could not receive a fair trial outside of Mexico. But the momentum was against them. The U.S. government had been embarrassed by the 1999 Matamoros standoff, and securing Osiel's extradition was not just a matter of law, it was personal. From his cell, Osiel tried to maintain the illusion of control. He communicated through intermediaries, sending instructions to loyal lieutenants and attempting to stabilize the Gulf Cartel's operations. But those instructions carried less and less weight. Los Zetas, no longer tethered to his direct authority, were emerging as a formidable force in their own right. They were expanding beyond Tamaulipas, seizing territories and building new revenue streams through kidnapping, extortion, and human trafficking. Many people still think that the rise of Los Zetas was the inevitable result of Osiel's leadership style. By empowering them so completely, he had created a paramilitary organization that could outlast him. Others argue that their autonomy was a natural evolution in a criminal landscape where power vacuums rarely lasted long. So what do you think? Was Osiel's creation of Los Zetas his masterstroke? Or his undoing? Outside the prison walls, the Mexican government was intensifying its crackdown on organized crime. Military operations targeted Gulf Cartel safe houses and warehouses, seizing tons of narcotics and arresting high-level operatives. These blows weakened the cartel's infrastructure and further undermined Osiel's influence. Still, he remained a larger-than-life figure to many. His name carried weight, and there were those in the Gulf Cartel who still looked to him for guidance. But as time passed, that loyalty was increasingly symbolic. In the brutal world of cartel politics, absence was often fatal to authority. By early 2004, the decision to extradite Osiel to the United States appeared inevitable. Mexican authorities, under intense pressure from Washington, were finalizing the paperwork and security plans necessary for the transfer. Osiel's attorneys filed a final round of appeals, but they were running out of legal options. In private moments, Osiel reportedly reflected on the chain of events that had led to his downfall. He thought about the betrayals that had paved the way for his capture and about the growing power of Los Zetas. He wondered whether he had been too cautious in his final months as a free man, too reluctant to confront those who might have been conspiring against him. Yet even in these moments of introspection, he did not allow despair to take root. Those who visited him in prison recalled that he still projected an air of confidence, as though he believed he might find a way to turn the situation to his advantage. There's an open, scholarly debate about whether Osiel truly believed he could reverse his fortunes, or whether this was simply a mask, a way of maintaining dignity in the face of inevitable defeat. So what do you think? Was Osiel a man still plotting his comeback, or one quietly coming to terms with the end of his era? Outside, the Gulf Cartel's situation grew more precarious by the day. Los Zetas' growing independence had destabilized the organization, and rival cartels were moving in to exploit the chaos. The once dominant Gulf Cartel was now fighting on multiple fronts, its cohesion shattered. From his cell, Osiel could only imagine the battles unfolding beyond the prison walls. He had always believed that his presence was the glue that held the organization together, and now he was watching from the sidelines as it fractured. But even as his influence waned, Osiel's story was far from over. The extradition process was nearing its conclusion, and with it would come a new chapter, one that would play out on American soil, under the watchful eye of a justice system determined to keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. And yet, even in the face of this reality, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén was not ready to fade quietly. The day the extradition order was finalized, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén sat in his cell with a cold, practiced stillness. The news was delivered by his attorney, whose expression betrayed the reality. Every legal maneuver, every last-ditch appeal had failed. The Mexican government, under relentless pressure from Washington, had approved Osiel's transfer to the United States. There would be no last-minute reprieve. For many, this would have been the moment of surrender. But Osiel wasn't wired that way. Even in defeat, he clung to the mindset that had propelled him from the streets of Matamoros to the top of the Gulf Cartel. Control the controllable. Influence what you can. He understood that extradition wasn't death, but it was close. Once on U.S. soil, he would face a justice system that would show no mercy. In the days leading up to his transfer, Osiel doubled down on communication with his network. Messages were passed through trusted attorneys and visitors, outlining instructions for lieutenants and warning against infighting. He knew the Gulf Cartel was splintering and that Los Zetas were no longer just an enforcement arm. They were a rival power structure with ambitions of their own. Many people still think that Osiel underestimated how quickly Los Zetas would break away completely. He believed his influence would persist, even from prison. Others argue that he recognized the inevitability of their split, but simply hoped to delay it. So what do you think? Was Osiel clinging to an illusion of control, or did he truly believe he could hold the organization together from behind bars? The extradition itself was carried out with the kind of precision reserved for high-value targets. At dawn, heavily armed Mexican federal police and soldiers descended on the prison. Osiel was escorted out in shackles, flanked by guards wearing black tactical gear and ballistic helmets. A convoy of armored vehicles transported him to an airfield where a waiting plane, chartered by U.S. authorities, idled on the tarmac. The transfer was swift and silent. No public statement was made until Osiel was already in U.S. custody, a deliberate strategy to avoid any attempt at rescue. When the announcement finally came, it was accompanied by images of Osiel being led off the plane, his head bowed but his posture still defiant. For the United States, his extradition was a victory years in the making. Federal prosecutors wasted no time unsealing indictments that painted Osiel as a ruthless cartel boss, responsible for flooding America with narcotics and ordering countless acts of violence. The evidence against him was overwhelming, drawn from years of investigations, wiretaps, and testimony from former associates. But for Osiel, the fight wasn't over. Once in American custody, he was held in a maximum security facility while awaiting trial. The isolation was intense, designed to sever any contact with the outside world. He was placed under special administrative measures, meaning his communications were heavily restricted and monitored. In those long, quiet hours, Osiel had ample time to reflect. He thought about his rise from the dusty streets of Matamoros, about the calculated moves that had made him a kingpin, and about the single betrayal that had brought it all crashing down. He also thought about Los Zetas, the men he had trained, armed, and elevated, now poised to inherit not just his enforcement legacy, but the Gulf Cartel's entire empire. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel's extradition was the death knell for the Gulf Cartel's unity or merely accelerated a process already in motion. Some argue that his absence left a leadership void that no one could fill, while others believe that the organization had been fracturing for years. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Los Zetas were beginning to flex their independence more openly. They expanded into new territories, introduced increasingly brutal tactics, and positioned themselves as a cartel in their own right. For civilians caught in the crossfire, this evolution marked the beginning of an even bloodier era. But within his cell, Osiel still believed he had a role to play. He began exploring options to negotiate with U.S. prosecutors, hoping to leverage information for reduced sentences or special protections. He also sought to maintain lines of communication with loyalists in Mexico, though the restrictions made this exceedingly difficult. And yet, even as his world shrank, Osiel's name remained potent. To his followers, he was still the architect of the Gulf Cartel's rise, a figure whose legend would endure long after the courtroom battles ended. As he awaited the next phase of his legal fight, the once powerful kingpin faced a sobering reality. His control over the empire he had built was slipping away, and the men he had once commanded were writing their own future without him. The reality of life in U.S. federal custody was a far cry from the world Osiel Cárdenas Guillén had once ruled. Gone were the armored convoys, the luxury estates, and the deference of men who feared him. Now, every move was dictated by strict prison schedules, every communication monitored or censored. He was a number, not a name, and the federal authorities made it clear that there would be no special treatment for the former Gulf Cartel kingpin. Osiel was housed in a maximum security facility, a place designed to contain the most dangerous criminals in the country. His days followed a rigid pattern: early wake-ups, controlled movements, limited recreation time, and meals consumed under the watchful eye of guards. He was placed under special administrative measures, which meant his ability to communicate with the outside world was severely restricted. Letters and phone calls were screened, and visits were limited to legal counsel or approved family members. For a man accustomed to commanding armies of loyal followers, the isolation was punishing. But Osiel was nothing if not adaptive. He used the time to study his case, consulting closely with his attorneys to explore every possible defense. He understood the stakes. The evidence compiled against him was formidable, and a conviction could mean spending the rest of his life in a U.S. prison. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel ever considered cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence. Some investigators believe he was weighing the possibility, calculating whether the information he held could be valuable enough to broker a deal. Others argue that the very idea would have been anathema to him, a betrayal of the code he had lived by. So what do you think? Could Osiel have been tempted to talk, or was his silence a matter of principle? Outside the walls of the prison, the Gulf Cartel was in disarray. Osiel's absence had created a power vacuum that no single figure could fill. Los Zetas, once his loyal enforcers, were rapidly expanding their influence, carving out territories and revenue streams independent of the cartel. Their leaders, Heriberto Lescano and Miguel Trevino Morales, were making bold moves, asserting themselves not just as enforcers, but as kingpins in their own right. Many people still think that Osiel underestimated just how quickly Los Zetas would rise. He had believed that their loyalty, forged in years of shared victories, would endure even in his absence. But loyalty in the world he had built was a fleeting commodity. Without his direct command, Los Zetas were free to follow their own ambitions, and those ambitions were boundless. The schism between the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas deepened as both groups jockeyed for control of key smuggling routes. Violence escalated across northeastern Mexico, with civilians often caught in the crossfire. This new wave of brutality, fueled by Los Zetas' military training and penchant for terror, marked a grim turning point in Mexico's drug war. From his cell, Osiel received fragmented reports of the chaos unfolding outside. He still had loyalists within the Gulf Cartel, and through carefully coded messages, he tried to guide their actions. But the reality was undeniable. His ability to influence events from prison was diminishing by the day. Meanwhile, the legal process marched forward. Federal prosecutors in the United States were building a case that painted Osiel as a kingpin, responsible for orchestrating an empire of violence and narcotics trafficking. They planned to introduce testimony from former associates who had turned government witnesses, men who knew the inner workings of the Gulf Cartel and were eager to trade their knowledge for reduced sentences. Osiel's attorneys fought hard, filing motions to suppress evidence and questioning the credibility of witnesses. But the sheer volume of the case was overwhelming. Years of wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover operations had produced a mountain of evidence, and prosecutors were confident they could secure a conviction. Even as he prepared for trial, Osiel remained a figure of fascination. Journalists followed every development in his case, speculating about what his testimony might reveal about the Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas, and the broader criminal networks that spanned the hemisphere. In Mexico, narco corridos, folk ballads celebrating the exploits of drug lords, still carried his name, a reminder that his legend endured even as his empire crumbled. But Osiel knew legends offered little comfort in the cold confines of a prison cell. His focus was on survival, legal, personal, and, if possible, political. He had once believed that his power was unshakable, that the Gulf Cartel could weather any storm. Now he was forced to confront the truth. The empire he had built was slipping from his grasp, and the men he had once commanded were rewriting the rules in his absence. And while he could still plot, still imagine scenarios in which he might regain influence, he could not escape the reality that the walls were closing in. The escalation of violence in Mexico following Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's capture was something he could only track through filtered reports. Even from the isolation of his U.S. federal prison cell, word trickled in. The Gulf Cartel, once a monolithic force under his control, was splintering, and Los Zetas were at the center of the storm. The group he had once created as his personal enforcement arm had evolved into a full-fledged cartel, one that wielded more military sophistication and unrestrained brutality than any other criminal organization in Mexico at the time. Under leaders like Heriberto Lascano and Miguel Trevino Morales, Los Zetas moved with impunity, seizing territory from the weakened Gulf Cartel and expanding into regions long dominated by rivals. Their willingness to use extreme violence shocked even hardened observers. Many people still think that Osiel's absence was the single greatest factor in Los Zetas' rise. Without his steadying influence, the Gulf Cartel lacked the centralized leadership required to maintain cohesion. Factions within the organization began fighting among themselves, each vying for control of the smuggling routes and lucrative trafficking profits that had once flowed unchallenged. In Tamaulipas, the state that had served as the Gulf Cartel's stronghold for decades, entire communities were caught in the crossfire. Shootouts erupted in broad daylight. Bodies appeared on roadsides with chilling messages attached, and kidnappings became a daily threat. Civilians fled towns where rival factions battled for supremacy, and the government's efforts to contain the violence often seemed futile. From his cell, Osiel reflected on the world outside and the legacy he had left behind. There's an open scholarly debate about whether he anticipated this level of chaos when he created Los Zetas. Some argue that he understood the risks, but believed their military discipline would keep them loyal. Others believe he simply never imagined that his own creation would one day challenge the Gulf Cartel itself. So what do you think? Was this chain of events inevitable? Or could Osiel have prevented it had he been free? The Mexican government, facing unprecedented levels of violence, escalated its own response. Military patrols became more frequent, raids targeted cartel hideouts, and officials vowed to restore order to regions engulfed by conflict. But these actions often intensified the violence rather than containing it. Los Zetas' retaliations were swift and merciless, designed to send a message not just to the government, but to any community suspected of cooperating with authorities. Meanwhile, the Gulf Cartel's remaining leadership struggled to adapt. Some factions sought truces with Los Zetas, hoping to avoid annihilation, while others doubled down, launching counterattacks that only deepened the bloodshed. The unity that had defined the cartel under Osiel's leadership was gone, replaced by mistrust and opportunism. In the United States, federal prosecutors continued building their case against Osiel, but even they acknowledged that removing him from Mexico had inadvertently destabilized the criminal landscape. The vacuum left by his capture had given rise to one of the most violent eras in modern Mexican history. Osiel, however, could do little about the situation beyond observing it from afar. His attorneys brought him updates, and occasional messages reached him through his limited network, but his ability to influence events on the ground was minimal. The empire he had built was now in the hands of men whose ambitions did not align with his own. The trial loomed over everything. Prosecutors were preparing to call a parade of witnesses, including former associates who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. These witnesses would describe in detail how Osiel had overseen the Gulf Cartel's operations, how he had cultivated corruption networks, and how Los Zetas had served as his enforcers. For Osiel, the trial was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a public dismantling of his myth. Every allegation would be scrutinized, every decision dissected. He knew that prosecutors would portray him as a kingpin who had flooded the United States with narcotics and left a trail of violence in his wake. And while he had faced threats to his life before, this was different. The U.S. justice system had no bribes to accept, no favors to grant. There's an open question among scholars about whether Osiel still believed he could regain power at this stage. Some suggest that he saw the trial as a chance to leverage information and negotiate a better outcome. Others believe he was resigned to the fact that his era as a free man was over, but resignation had never been in Osiel's nature. Even in the controlled monotony of prison, he continued to plan, to think, to imagine ways he might reclaim a measure of influence. He understood that knowledge was currency, and he had more knowledge about Mexico's criminal networks than almost anyone alive. As the trial date approached, Osiel faced a stark reality. The world outside was changing rapidly, and the empire he had once ruled was now a battlefield. Whether he could use the courtroom as a stage to rewrite his fate, or whether it would become the final act of his legacy, remained to be seen. By the time Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's trial approached, the chaos outside his prison walls had reached a fever pitch. Mexico's drug war was intensifying, with Los Zetas now openly at odds with the remnants of the Gulf cartel. Shootouts erupted across Tamaulipas and Veracruz, leaving streets littered with shell casings and civilians trapped in the crossfire. For ordinary people, it felt like the violence was endless, a storm with no safe harbor. Osiel followed these developments with a mixture of frustration and inevitability. Reports filtered into his cell through attorneys and the few trusted visitors permitted under his strict security measures. Each update painted the same bleak picture. Los Zetas, the group he had once molded into his iron fist, had now become a cartel unto themselves. Their leaders, Heriberto Lascano and Miguel Trevino Morales, were seizing territory and revenues once controlled by Osiel's loyalists. Many people still think that this breakaway was the ultimate proof that Osiel's strategy had backfired. What had been conceived as a solution to enforce discipline within the Gulf cartel had instead created a rival organization that outmatched its parent in military strength and terror tactics. Others argue that Los Zetas' rise was inevitable in a criminal landscape where power vacuums rarely go unfilled. So what do you think? Was Osiel's downfall rooted in miscalculation? Or was he simply a casualty of forces bigger than himself? The Gulf cartel, now fractured, struggled to mount a coordinated response. Its remaining leaders lacked Osiel's charisma and ability to unify competing factions. Some chose to ally temporarily with rival cartels like Sinaloa or La Familia Michoacana to survive, while others attempted to fight Los Zetas head-on. Neither strategy offered a sustainable solution. From his cell, Osiel tried to exert influence where he could. Through carefully coded messages passed via attorneys, he urged his loyalists to maintain cohesion and resist Los Zetas' incursions. But the reality was grim. His directives carried less weight with each passing month. Without his presence, allegiances were shifting quickly, and men who once swore loyalty to him were now pledging allegiance to whoever could guarantee their survival. In the United States, federal prosecutors moved steadily forward with their case. They had amassed a staggering volume of evidence, from years of surveillance to testimony from high-ranking defectors. Former Gulf cartel operatives were prepared to describe in detail how Osiel had overseen massive drug shipments, laundered millions in profits, and ordered the assassinations of rivals and suspected traitors. The prosecution's case was bolstered by the Matamoros incident of 1999, when Osiel had confronted U.S. federal agents and threatened to kill them. That act, brazen and defiant, was a centerpiece of the narrative prosecutors sought to present. A cartel boss who believed himself untouchable, willing to challenge even the most powerful government on earth. Osiel's defense attorneys faced a daunting challenge. They sought to undermine the credibility of government witnesses, many of whom were former cartel members seeking reduced sentences. They argued that the prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from individuals who had every incentive to lie. But even the defense team knew that the weight of the evidence was formidable. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel considered cooperating with U.S. authorities at this stage. Some believe he weighed the possibility of trading information for a lighter sentence, particularly as he watched Los Zetas dismantle his legacy from afar. Others insist that the idea of becoming an informant was unthinkable, a violation of the code he had lived by. Meanwhile, Los Zetas' violence escalated to levels that shocked even seasoned law enforcement. They carried out mass killings, left bodies hanging from bridges, and terrorized communities with displays of cruelty designed to cow rivals and civilians alike. Their tactics pushed Mexico into a new era of brutality, one that made Osiel's reign, for all its bloodshed, appear comparatively restrained. From his prison cell, Osiel could only imagine the scale of the carnage. He understood the forces at play. Without a central leader, the Gulf cartel was bleeding out, and Los Zetas were capitalizing on every weakness. He had once believed his presence was the glue that held the organization together. And now, he was witnessing the consequences of its absence. As the trial date neared, Osiel's focus shifted inward. He knew that the outcome could determine not just the length of his sentence, but his ability to influence events from behind bars. If he were consigned to a life sentence in a maximum security facility, his already tenuous grip on the Gulf cartel would vanish completely. He spent hours with his attorneys strategizing, poring over evidence, and rehearsing potential testimony. He scrutinized every witness on the prosecution's list, searching for inconsistencies that could be exploited. But privately, Osiel understood that the odds were stacked against him. The United States had invested years of resources into bringing him to justice. Federal agents, prosecutors, and politicians alike wanted a conviction that would send a message. Even the most powerful cartel leaders could not escape accountability forever. And yet, for all the inevitabilities surrounding the trial, Osiel held onto the same quality that had propelled him to the top of the Gulf cartel: a refusal to concede defeat until the final moment. He would fight, he told himself, with the same tenacity he had shown on the streets of Matamoros decades earlier. But in the world Osiel now inhabited, tenacity alone might not be enough. When the day of the trial finally arrived, the courthouse was buzzing with tension. Federal prosecutors had built their case meticulously over years, and their objective was clear: to dismantle whatever myth of invincibility remained around Osiel Cárdenas Guillén and secure a conviction that would echo across the hemisphere. For Osiel, this was no ordinary courtroom battle. It was the ultimate test of his resilience, his wits, and his ability to exert control in a world that was rapidly slipping beyond his grasp. The trial drew intense media attention. Journalists from both the United States and Mexico crowded the courthouse steps, eager to capture images of the man who had once been considered untouchable. Inside the courtroom, Osiel was seated quietly at the defense table, his expression unreadable. He wore the same calm demeanor that had carried him through cartel meetings and high-stakes negotiations. But those who looked closely could see the weight of the situation etched in the lines around his eyes. The prosecution wasted no time setting the tone. They painted Osiel as the architect of a vast criminal empire responsible for flooding the United States with narcotics and terrorizing communities in Mexico. They highlighted the Matamoros standoff of 1999, describing how Osiel had brazenly threatened to kill U.S. federal agents. an act that prosecutors argued symbolized his utter disregard for law and life. One by one, former cartel associates took the stand. These were men who had once operated in Osiel's inner circle, now cooperating with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences. They described how Osiel had ordered hits on rivals, orchestrated smuggling operations, and built Los Zetas into a fearsome enforcement arm. Their testimony was detailed, often chilling, and it corroborated the mountain of evidence prosecutors had amassed. The defense sought to undermine these witnesses, arguing that they were motivated by self-preservation rather than truth. They questioned inconsistencies in their stories, suggested that law enforcement had coached their testimony, and reminded jurors that many of these men had committed heinous crimes themselves. But the weight of the evidence was difficult to counter. Wiretaps, surveillance photos, and financial records all tied Osiel to the Gulf Cartel's operations. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel truly believed he could win the trial, or whether his primary goal was to maintain dignity and influence, even in defeat. Some argue that he clung to the belief that a not guilty verdict was possible, while others believe he viewed the trial as an opportunity to demonstrate strength to allies and enemies alike. So what do you think? Was Osiel fighting for freedom or simply for legacy? Meanwhile, events in Mexico continued to spiral. Los Zetas were expanding their reach at a terrifying pace, and the Gulf Cartel's remaining factions were locked in a losing battle to reclaim lost territory. Violence flared in Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and Veracruz, leaving entire communities terrorized. Osiel was acutely aware of these developments. From his cell, he received reports detailing the Gulf Cartel's mounting losses and the atrocities committed by Los Zetas. It was a bitter reality. The very group he had created to strengthen his hold on power was now dismantling the empire he had built. As the trial entered its final stages, the prosecution delivered a closing argument that encapsulated their narrative. They described Osiel as a man who had built his empire on blood and fear, a man who believed himself beyond the reach of justice until the moment the walls closed in. They asked the jury to hold him accountable, not just for his own actions, but for the damage wrought by the organization he had led. The defense, in its closing argument, urged jurors to question the credibility of government witnesses and to consider the possibility that the prosecution's case was built on the word of criminals seeking to save themselves. They reminded the jury of the high standard of proof required for conviction, appealing to their sense of fairness. But when the jury returned, the verdict was decisive. Osiel Cárdenas Guillén was found guilty on multiple counts, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and threatening U.S. federal agents. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Osiel sat motionless, his expression as inscrutable as ever. There was no visible outburst, no sign of despair. He had long understood that this was the likely outcome. The sentencing that followed was equally severe. The judge handed down a lengthy prison term that would ensure Osiel spent the rest of his life behind bars. Federal authorities framed the outcome as a major victory in the war on drugs, a demonstration that even the most powerful cartel leaders could be brought to justice. For Osiel, the verdict marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. He was now a prisoner of the U.S. federal system, with little chance of ever regaining his freedom. But even in that moment, he remained a figure of fascination and influence, because outside those prison walls, the legacy of his decisions, the rise of Los Zetas, the fragmentation of the Gulf Cartel, and the violence that engulfed Mexico, was still unfolding. The verdict was final, but the reverberations of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's conviction continued to echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom. For the U.S. government, it was a significant victory in the war on drugs, a public demonstration that even the most powerful cartel leaders could not evade justice forever. In press conferences, federal officials praised the years-long investigation, while news outlets ran headlines framing Osiel's downfall as a crippling blow to the Gulf Cartel. But the reality on the ground in Mexico told a different story. Far from stabilizing the situation, Osiel's removal had left the Gulf Cartel fractured and vulnerable. Los Zetas, no longer tethered by his authority, expanded rapidly, establishing themselves as one of the most violent and dominant cartels in Mexico. Entire regions that had once fallen neatly under Gulf Cartel control were now war zones as former allies became bitter enemies. Osiel followed these developments from his maximum security cell with a sense of bitter irony. He had built Los Zetas to secure the Gulf Cartel's future, and now they were dismantling it piece by piece. Many people still think that this outcome was the inevitable result of empowering a paramilitary force capable of operating independently. Others argue that if Osiel had remained free, he might have found a way to rein Los Zetas back in before they broke away entirely. So what do you think? Was this collapse unavoidable, or could Osiel have prevented it? Had circumstances been different, from prison, Osiel's ability to exert influence was nearly non-existent. The strict conditions of his confinement meant he could not communicate freely with the outside world. Every letter and phone call was monitored, every visitor carefully vetted. While he occasionally managed to send coded messages through attorneys or trusted intermediaries, the reach of those communications was limited. Meanwhile, Los Zetas' tactics were pushing Mexico into an even darker chapter of its drug war. They engaged in acts of terror designed to intimidate not just rival cartels, but entire communities. Bodies were left hanging from bridges, mass graves were discovered in remote areas, and kidnappings became routine. Their militaristic training and willingness to use extreme violence made them a uniquely dangerous adversary for Mexican authorities. The Gulf Cartel's remaining factions struggled to survive in this new reality. Some sought alliances with rival cartels like Sinaloa or La Familia Michoacana, while others tried to reclaim territory from Los Zetas directly. But these efforts often backfired, fueling even more bloodshed. What had once been a unified organization under Osiel's leadership was now a loose collection of factions, each fighting for its own survival. In the United States, Osiel's legal options were exhausted. Appeals were filed but ultimately denied, and the life sentence imposed by the federal court became his new reality. He was transferred to a Supermax facility designed to hold the nation's most dangerous and escape-prone inmates. There, his world shrank to a small concrete cell, and his contact with other human beings was minimal. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel retained any meaningful influence over the Gulf Cartel from this point forward. Some believe that his legend alone continued to inspire loyalty among older operatives, while others argue that the organization had moved on entirely, shaped now by the ambitions of new leaders and the brutality of Los Zetas. Osiel himself likely understood that his time as a central figure in the cartel's operations had passed. Yet, he was not a man who surrendered easily to irrelevance. Those who studied his case believe he continued to scheme in whatever small ways he could, hoping to shape events from behind the walls. Whether those efforts had any tangible impact is difficult to say. What's undeniable is that the world Osiel left behind was one of escalating chaos, The violence unleashed by Los Zetas' rise and the Gulf Cartel's collapse would claim tens of thousands of lives in the years to come. Communities once bound by a grim stability under Osiel's rule now faced unrelenting terror from multiple fronts, and as Mexican authorities, with U.S. support, struggled to contain the bloodshed, many quietly wondered whether removing Osiel had truly weakened the cartels or merely transformed them into something even more dangerous. Osiel, confined to his small cell, could only imagine the carnage he had set in motion. He was no longer the man giving orders from a fortified ranch or flashing his easy smile at lieutenants gathered around a table. He was a prisoner, a man whose choices had reshaped the criminal underworld in ways he could neither reverse nor fully control. But even in the isolation of his Supermax confinement, one thing remained true. The legend of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén was not fading. It was being written anew, in blood, across the streets of Mexico. The Supermax prison that now held Osiel Cárdenas Guillén was a world built to break men. Isolated 23 hours a day in a concrete cell the size of a small bathroom, he had almost no human contact. Meals were slid through a slot in the steel door. Exercise consisted of pacing in a caged outdoor pen, alone, with no view beyond the razor wire above. The lights were always on, the cameras always watching. For a man who had once commanded the fear and loyalty of hundreds, this kind of isolation was suffocating. But Osiel had long been a strategist, and even within these limits, he sought to preserve some measure of control. He read obsessively, legal documents, news reports, anything that connected him to the world beyond his walls. He maintained correspondence with his attorneys and a handful of family members, carefully choosing words that wouldn't trigger suspicion from the prison's monitors. Outside, the world was spinning further into chaos. Los Zetas had fully severed ties with the Gulf Cartel and declared themselves an independent organization. They had the military training, the weapons, and the willingness to use unrestrained violence, and their rise was transforming Mexico's criminal landscape. They were no longer just a paramilitary enforcement wing. They were a cartel in their own right, feared for their unpredictability and brutality. Many people still think Osiel had created a monster that even he couldn't have controlled had he been free. Los Zetas' tactics, mass executions, public displays of terror, and indiscriminate targeting of civilians were far beyond the relatively calculated violence of Osiel's reign. Others argue that his leadership might have kept them in check, that his ability to unify factions could have prevented the bloodbath that now engulfed Mexico. So what do you think? Did Osiel's removal unleash Los Zetas, or was their ascension inevitable? The Gulf Cartel's remaining factions were struggling. Without Osiel's unifying presence, lieutenants turned on each other in battles for leadership. Alliances were fleeting, betrayals common. Key smuggling routes along the U.S.-Mexico border became battlegrounds as Los Zetas pushed to seize control, and the Gulf Cartel, weakened and divided, could only respond with desperation. From his cell, Osiel received occasional updates about the violence. Trusted intermediaries relayed coded messages about which territories had been lost, which allies had defected, and how many Gulf Cartel operatives had been killed. Each message carried the weight of inevitability. His empire was collapsing. There's an open, scholarly debate about how much influence Osiel truly retained at this stage. Some argue that his name alone still commanded loyalty among older cartel operatives, that his legend functioned as a kind of symbolic glue. Others believe that any practical influence he had was gone, replaced by new power structures that no longer felt tethered to him. Regardless, Osiel seemed to accept that his ability to shape the organization's future was minimal, but that didn't mean he had given up entirely. He continued to pass along occasional directives through the narrow channels available to him, urging unity among the Gulf cartel's factions and warning against further infighting. Meanwhile, Los Zetas' violence was making international headlines. Their attacks were bolder, more theatrical, designed to terrify. Bodies left hanging from bridges, entire towns emptied by fear. It was a campaign of psychological warfare as much as physical domination. For civilians, the situation was catastrophic. Communities across Tamaulipas, Nuevo Leon, and Veracruz became ghost towns as residents fled the unrelenting terror. Osiel, once the architect of the Gulf cartel's disciplined dominance, now watched from afar as the landscape he had shaped crumbled. He had always believed that leadership required balance, discipline tempered with incentives, fear tempered with opportunity. Los Zetas had abandoned that balance, embracing unrestrained terror as a strategy, and the results were devastating. As months turned into years, Osiel's trial faded from the headlines, replaced by coverage of the escalating drug war in Mexico. But within prison walls, he remained a figure of fascination. Guards whispered about his past, fellow inmates speculated about his influence, and researchers analyzed the decisions that had defined his rise and fall. Many people still think about the what-ifs. What if Osiel had never created Los Zetas? What if he had been able to escape capture in 2003? Would the Gulf cartel have remained unified, avoiding the bloodshed that followed? Or was this spiral into chaos always the inevitable outcome of a world built on violence and corruption? For Osiel, these questions were less academic. He had built an empire only to watch it collapse in his absence, and the weight of that failure was something he carried alone in his cell. And yet, even in the silence of the Supermax, the legend of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén continued to grow. The legend of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén lived on outside the Supermax prison walls. But for Osiel himself, each day was a slow battle against monotony. The cell never changed. The routine never changed. The only thing that shifted was the world beyond the concrete, and Osiel could only glimpse it through news clippings or the rare messages that reached him through intermediaries. In Mexico, the Gulf cartel's decline was accelerating. Without a central leader, factions were tearing themselves apart. Former allies became enemies, and the cartel was locked in a brutal war with Los Zetas, who are now one of the most feared criminal organizations in the hemisphere. Their reputation for terror had surpassed even the bloodiest years of Osiel's rule. Osiel had always believed in discipline, in maintaining a certain structure even within a criminal empire. Los Zetas had thrown that philosophy aside. They ruled through chaos, inflicting violence so extreme that entire communities abandoned their homes rather than risk becoming collateral damage. Many people still think that the loss of Osiel's leadership created a vacuum that allowed this kind of unrestrained brutality to flourish. Others argue that the drug war was destined to evolve into something even more savage, with or without him. So what do you think? Was this level of violence inevitable, or did Osiel's absence tip the balance? Back in the United States, Osiel's days were filled with legal paperwork and the small rituals that helped him endure his isolation. He wrote letters, carefully monitored, of course, to family members, offering reassurances he often didn't feel himself. He met periodically with his attorneys, though his appeals had little chance of success. Each court rejection was another reminder that his life as a free man was over. Yet, Osiel's mind never stopped working. He remained an analyst at heart, studying the reports he received about the drug war. He noted which Gulf cartel factions were aligning with rival organizations like the Sinaloa cartel or La Familia Michoacana, which territories had fallen to Los Zetas, and which key figures were still alive. He still believed that unity could save the Gulf cartel, even if he was no longer in a position to enforce it. Through these coded messages, Osiel tried to play peacemaker from afar. He urged his former lieutenants to set aside personal grudges and focus on reclaiming lost territory. But these appeals rarely reached their intended audience intact, and even when they did, they carried little weight. The men now leading the Gulf cartel were fighting for their lives, and the concept of unity seemed increasingly abstract. Meanwhile, Los Zetas were expanding aggressively. They had diversified their criminal operations beyond drug trafficking, branching into extortion, human smuggling, oil theft, and kidnapping. Their leaders, Heriberto Lascano and Miguel Trevino Morales, were turning the organization into a multifaceted criminal enterprise with tentacles in nearly every sector of Mexico's underground economy. Osiel, from his cell, could only imagine how different things might have been had he remained in control. He had prided himself on balancing fear with incentive, on ensuring that even those on the lowest rungs of the cartel felt invested in its success. Los Zetas had abandoned this balance, ruling through pure terror. That strategy brought short-term compliance, but it also bred enemies on every side, from rival cartels to government forces to terrified communities. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Osiel's presence could have slowed Los Zetas' rise. Some experts argue that his leadership might have delayed the group's full independence, while others believe that the splintering of the Gulf cartel was inevitable given the money and power at stake. What's undeniable is that the violence was now worse than ever. Mexican authorities launched major operations to capture or kill Los Zetas leaders, often with U.S. intelligence support. These raids occasionally produced high-profile successes, but they also sparked violent reprisals. Entire cities were paralyzed by gun battles, and the death toll climbed year after year. Osiel's name, though he was locked away in an American prison, was still invoked in Mexico's narco corridos and whispered conversations. Some older Gulf cartel operatives held out hope that he might one day return, though the reality of his life sentence made that fantasy unlikely. Others cursed him, blaming him for creating the paramilitary force that had unleashed unprecedented bloodshed. Inside the Supermax, Osiel was aware of both sentiments, though he had no way to respond. He lived in silence, his days marked by the distant hum of prison machinery and the occasional thud of a door closing somewhere down the corridor. But even as his world narrowed to those few square feet of concrete and steel, Osiel's mind remained sharp. He still believed that history would not forget him, that the legend of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén would outlive the prison walls and the factions now fighting over the ruins of his empire. Years passed, and the world outside Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's cell continued to convulse with violence. The drug war in Mexico showed no signs of slowing. Los Zetas had expanded their operations nationwide, and their rivals, including what remained of the Gulf cartel, were locked in battles for survival. The headlines were relentless: mass killings, cartel blockades, police assassinations. Entire communities were paralyzed by fear, and the death toll rose into the tens of thousands. For Osiel, confined to his Supermax prison cell in the United States, the news was both a lifeline and a torment. He read every article his attorneys brought, dissected every scrap of information passed through family members, and tried to make sense of how the empire he had built had unraveled so completely. Many people still think about whether Osiel's capture was a turning point that worsened the violence in Mexico. Some argue that his leadership, for all its brutality, at least maintained order and discipline. Others believe that the war's escalation was inevitable, that no single man could have contained the forces at play. So what do you think? Did removing Osiel save lives in the long term, or did it fracture the underworld in a way that unleashed chaos? From his cell, Osiel could see the outlines of a pattern he recognized all too well. Power vacuums create opportunities, and opportunities breed conflict. Los Zetas, now fully independent, were not just fighting the Gulf Cartel, but also clashing with rivals like the Sinaloa Cartel and La Familia Michoacana. Each battle carved new scars into Mexico's landscape. The Gulf Cartel, meanwhile, was a shadow of its former self. Its factions operated like independent gangs, often at odds with one another. Leaders were killed or arrested with alarming frequency, and the cartel's once legendary smuggling routes were now vulnerable to encroachment by rivals. Osiel's name still carried weight among older operatives, and there were whispers that he might be able to unify the cartel's fractured remnants from afar. But the reality was harsher. His life sentence in the U.S. made direct influence nearly impossible, and any orders he tried to send were diluted, intercepted, or ignored. Despite these limitations, Osiel still plotted in the shadows. He passed coded messages through attorneys and family members, urging surviving Gulf cartel leaders to rebuild alliances and focus on common goals. He warned them that continued infighting would only strengthen Los Zetas. But by this stage, his voice was little more than an echo of a bygone era. Los Zetas' reign of terror was now a defining feature of the drug war. Their brutality was unmatched, and their methods shocked even hardened cartel observers. They employed mass killings as tools of intimidation, left dismembered bodies in public places, and kidnapped civilians for ransom or coercion. Their tactics made them deeply feared, but they also made them enemies of everyone, including the Mexican government, rival cartels, and increasingly, the communities they exploited. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Los Zetas' reliance on terror was sustainable. Some argue that it would inevitably provoke a united backlash, while others believe it was an effective strategy for seizing and holding territory. Osiel, with his instinct for balance, likely saw the dangers of such unrestrained violence, but he had no way to impose his philosophy from within the prison walls. The United States, for its part, continued to view Osiel as a high-value prisoner. He remained under strict special administrative measures, and any requests for leniency or transfer were swiftly denied. Federal authorities believed that even a hint of communication from Osiel could destabilize Mexico's fragile criminal landscape further, and so, Osiel's world remained painfully small. He paced his cell, reviewed his legal options, though none seemed promising, and waited for the occasional visit from his attorneys or family. He had always been a man of action, but now action was impossible. His legacy, for better or worse, was being rewritten by others. Outside, the myth of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén endured. Narco-corridos still sang of his rise from the streets of Matamoros, of the years when the Gulf Cartel was unified and feared. Younger generations of cartel members who had never met him spoke his name with a mixture of reverence and curiosity. But legends can't change reality. And the reality was that Osiel's era had ended, leaving behind a legacy of fractured power, unchecked violence, and a criminal landscape far bloodier than the one he had once controlled. By the time a decade had passed since his capture, Osiel Cárdenas Guillén was more myth than man to many of the operatives now running Mexico's drug war. In hushed conversations among Gulf cartel veterans, his name was invoked like a ghost of the old days, when a single man's authority could keep the organization unified. But for the new generation, Osiel was a distant figure locked away in a foreign prison, a reminder of a time before the chaos became all-consuming. From his cell in the U.S. Supermax facility, Osiel lived in a routine as stark and unchanging as the gray concrete around him. Wake up at dawn, meals through the slot, hours alone with books, legal documents, and the occasional news clipping. Exercise once a day in a small fenced yard where the sky was visible but out of reach. For a man who once commanded armies of armed men, the monotony was its own punishment. Yet Osiel's mind never stopped turning. He analyzed the trickle of information he received about the ongoing cartel wars. Alliances forged and broken, leaders arrested or killed, territories lost and retaken. Los Zetas, once his enforcers, had now become one of the most feared criminal syndicates in the hemisphere. But cracks were beginning to show. Their unchecked brutality had alienated civilians, rival cartels, and even some of their own operatives. Many people still think that Los Zetas' downfall was inevitable the moment they embraced terror as a strategy. Others argue that their collapse only began because Mexican authorities, supported by U.S. intelligence, shifted focus to dismantling them after years of unchecked growth. So what do you think? Did Los Zetas engineer their own fall? Or were they finally facing the kind of concentrated pressure that Osiel had once evaded? From prison, Osiel heard whispers that some factions of the Gulf cartel were attempting to rebuild. These were men who remembered the structure he had once imposed, who believed that unity was the only way forward. But the Gulf cartel was no longer the disciplined organization of Osiel's era. Its leaders were fragmented, and its resources depleted. Osiel occasionally managed to send messages through trusted intermediaries, urging reconciliation and strategy. But these appeals were often ignored or distorted. Younger leaders, hardened by years of relentless conflict, had no interest in following the guidance of a man locked away thousands of miles from the fight. Meanwhile, Los Zetas were under increasing pressure. High-profile leaders like Heriberto Lascano were being killed, and Miguel Trevino Morales would soon follow. Their organization began fracturing, just as the Gulf cartel had years earlier. Some splinter groups continued using the Zetas name, while others rebranded, further muddying the criminal landscape. Osiel could only watch from afar as the power structures he had once known dissolved into a patchwork of smaller, more unpredictable factions. The drug war, once dominated by a few major players, had become a multi-sided conflict where alliances shifted weekly and violence was a constant. There's an open scholarly debate about whether the dismantling of these larger cartels has made Mexico safer or more dangerous. Some argue that smaller groups lack the resources to commit mass atrocities, while others believe the lack of centralized control has only fueled instability. For Osiel, these questions weren't abstract. He understood better than most that leadership mattered, that discipline, however brutal, could at least impose a semblance of order. Now, he was witnessing a world where no one could impose that order, where the chaos he had feared was permanent. Yet even in isolation, Osiel's name continued to hold power. Older Gulf cartel operatives spoke of him as a symbol of what the organization could be. Narco corridos kept his story alive, romanticizing his rise and lamenting the empire's fall. Young recruits who had never met him still studied his tactics as lessons in how to build and maintain power. But Osiel knew that legends couldn't change the reality of his life. He was a prisoner, with no realistic chance of release, no meaningful influence over the forces reshaping the underworld he had once dominated. And as he lay awake at night in the silence of his cell, he may have wondered what it had all been for. The empire, the power, the choices that had left him a ghost in the concrete halls of a prison thousands of miles from home. Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's life inside the Supermax facility had become a meditation on isolation. The same walls that closed in each day also insulated him from the violent legacy playing out beyond them. He had outlived many of his contemporaries, some killed by rivals, others cut down by law enforcement, but he had done so at a cost. A life reduced to concrete, steel, and routine. Every so often, Osiel would catch glimpses of his enduring reputation through the sparse news he was allowed. Journalists still referred to him as the man who had once unified the Gulf Cartel, the architect of a criminal empire that spanned borders. Narco-corridos still romanticized his story, though they often blurred the lines between fact and fiction. And in some ways, this myth-making stung. He had become a symbol more than a man, and symbols had no control over the forces that invoked their names. The Gulf Cartel itself was a shadow of the organization Osiel had once commanded. What remained was a loose confederation of factions, many fighting each other as fiercely as they fought rivals like the Sinaloa Cartel or the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. Los Zetas, the once mighty enforcers who had splintered away, were now largely dismantled, their remnants absorbed by other groups. Many people still think about whether Osiel's continued leadership could have kept the Gulf Cartel intact. Could he have prevented Los Zetas' split? Could he have shielded Mexico from the surge in violence that followed his downfall? Or was the cycle of betrayal and bloodshed inevitable, a consequence of a system that devours even its strongest players? So what do you think? Could one man, even Osiel, have truly changed the trajectory? From his cell, Osiel knew the answer no longer mattered. He had once believed that his presence was the glue holding everything together, but now the empire had been rebuilt and dismantled multiple times without him. He was an artifact of another era, remembered more for the legend than the man he actually was. Still, the instincts that had carried him from the streets of Matamoros to the top of a criminal empire never fully left him. He analyzed every fragment of news, every whispered report that filtered through his attorneys, looking for patterns, for ways to predict the next shift in Mexico's cartel wars. He shared thoughts when he could, slipping coded suggestions through the narrow channels of communication available to him. But whether those messages shaped anything beyond the prison walls was impossible to know. The nights were the hardest. Alone in his cell, Osiel would sometimes replay the critical moments of his life. The rise through the ranks, the creation of Los Zetas, the night the convoy was ambushed and the world changed forever. He would think about the betrayals, the close calls, and the decisions that had brought him here. And then, slowly, the pace of his thoughts would begin to soften. The constant buzz of strategy, of wondering what could have been, would fade into the hum of the prison's distant machinery. He would picture Matamoros as it had been when he was young, the streets buzzing with life, the air warm and heavy with the scent of dust and salt water. He would think of his family, of moments before the weight of power had ever touched his shoulders. In those moments, the legend of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén receded, and he was simply a man, one who had climbed higher than most, fallen farther than most, and was now left to reckon with the choices that had defined him. The Gulf cartel would continue to change, splinter, and reform without him. Los Zetas, the monster he had created, was gone, though its legacy still shaped Mexico's criminal landscape. And Osiel remained in his cell, a ghost of a bygone era, remembered but removed, watching as the world moved on. The hum of the ventilation filled the silence, soft and steady. Somewhere in the distance, a door clanged shut, echoing faintly through the halls, and slowly, Osiel closed his eyes. Now that we've reached the end of Osiel Cárdenas Guillén's journey, take a deep breath and let the story settle. There's something sobering about reflecting on a life like his, a rise built on ambition and calculation, and a fall shaped by the very forces he once controlled. His story is a reminder of how fragile power can be and how quickly it can slip away, no matter how strong you believe your grip is. Picture yourself now, lying comfortably wherever you're listening. The world around you feels quieter, slower, softer. The harsh edges of the story fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of your own breathing. Inhale slowly, hold for a beat, and exhale, letting your shoulders sink deeper into rest. The chaos of the world outside, the headlines, the noise, the responsibilities, can wait until tomorrow. For now, you are safe. You are exactly where you need to be, and nothing else matters. The sound of your breath is steady, like the ocean's tide brushing gently against the shore. Each inhale draws in calm. Each exhale releases the weight you've been carrying all day. As the final images of Osiel's story dissolve, imagine the distant hum of a fan or the soft patter of rain on a roof. These small, familiar sounds are anchors, keeping you grounded as your mind begins to drift. And when you're ready, allow yourself to let go completely. Your body is heavy, your thoughts are light, and the darkness behind your closed eyes is warm and safe. You don't need to chase sleep. It will find you naturally, like it always does. Good night and sweet dreams.